Welcome, history masochists. Lie down in your cozy bed and take a comfy blanket. Forget everything you think you know about Roman food. Erase those lavish mental images of reclining patricians stuffing themselves with peacocks' tongues and dormice. Banish the thought of exotic spices and fine wines flowing like, well, fine wine. We're not here to discuss the Roman elite, whose diets were so obscenely decadent they probably invented gout and competitive vomiting. No, my friends, we are here to plunge headfirst into the culinary abyss of the common folk. We're here to shatter your pristine, HBO-esque images of Roman opulence and replace them with something far more accurate: the gritty, monotonous reality of ancient caloric intake. Prepare for a journey that will make your blandest Tuesday night microwave meal feel like a Michelin-starred event. Now, when we talk about the peasant problem, and believe me, it was a problem, usually involving a distinct lack of anything palatable, who exactly are we talking about? We're not just talking about farmers with straw hats and pitchforks, though they certainly form a significant chunk of our suffering demographic. Oh no, the term peasant in the Roman context is a gloriously broad umbrella, covering everyone from the rural poor scratching a living from unforgiving soil to the urban poor, the plebs, packed into dilapidated insulae in Rome itself, day laborers with calloused hands and perpetually grumbling stomachs. These were the vast, unseen majority, the human-powered engine that drove an empire built on questionable carbohydrates and an absolute ocean of elbow grease. They were the ones who built the roads, fought the wars, tilled the fields, and generally ensured that the fancy senators had their precious peacocks' tongues. And they did it all on a diet that would make a modern nutritionist weep into their chia seed smoothie. So, why does any of this matter? Why dedicate the better part of 3 hours and 20 minutes of your precious existence to this grim culinary archaeology? Well, apart from offering you an unprecedented opportunity for a truly epic power nap, understanding the foundation of Roman society means understanding the plates, or lack thereof, of the people who formed that foundation. It's about grasping the true, gritty cost of empire, built literally on the backs of an underfed workforce. It's about realizing that while Rome had its colosseums and aqueducts, the average citizen was just trying to get enough spelt gruel to make it through the day without collapsing. And, perhaps most importantly, it's about making you profoundly, existentially thankful for modern refrigeration, instant noodles, and the sheer, unadulterated miracle of a grocery store that sells more than just barley and olive oil. Honestly, after this, you'll look at your fridge with a reverence usually reserved for deities. Now, for our roadmap, a brief, tongue-in-cheek overview of the arduous yet meticulously researched journey ahead. We'll delve into who these peasants were, the unholy trinity of grains, olives, and grapes that defined their diet, and then we'll break down each component, from the perpetually depressing pulse to the mythical concept of meat. We'll explore cooking methods that involved more smoke inhalation than actual culinary skill, the constant battle against famine, and the sheer, unyielding monotony that defined ancient eating. We'll uncover the archaeological secrets of ancient trash heaps and the biased literary ramblings of the elite. By the end, you'll not only know what Roman peasants ate, but feel like you've tasted it, smelled it, and perhaps even developed a mild, historically accurate case of scurvy. Buckle up, buttercups. This is going to be a long, dry, and thoroughly unappetizing ride. All right, let's nail down this slippery concept of peasant. Because in the Roman world, it wasn't some neat little box, neatly labeled and tied with a bow. Oh no. It was more like a vast, sprawling, socio-economic swamp, teeming with humanity, all of whom were decidedly not rolling ancestresses. We're talking about the immense spectrum of humanity that existed squarely below the senatorial elite, the equestrian order, and even the comfortable wealthy plebeians. This was the sprawling mass of the forgotten, the unglamorous, the perpetually exhausted majority, whose names rarely braced a history scroll, unless it was for a tax record or a criminal complaint. They were the background noise of empire, the faceless throng, the indispensable engine, and they formed the vast, uncelebrated foundation upon which all of Rome's grandeur was built. First, let's consider the rural poor. Picture, if you will, the sun-baked, dust-choked landscapes of the Italian countryside. Here, you'd find small landholders, clinging to their meager plots like desperate barnacles to a ship's hull. These were farmers, yes, but not the romanticized yeomen of later eras. Their land was often marginal, the soil unforgiving, and the yields barely enough to feed a family, let alone provide a surplus. They were perpetually teetering on the edge of disaster, one bad harvest away from ruin. Then there were the tenant farmers, working someone else's sprawling latifundia, paying exorbitant rents, usually a significant portion of their already meager harvest, to an absentee landlord lounging in a villa somewhere. Imagine working all year, pouring your sweat and blood into the earth, only for a fat chunk of your produce to vanish into the coffers of a rich man who barely knew your name. That was the reality. And below them, the agricultural laborers, day workers hired seasonally, toiling in the sun from dawn till dusk for barely enough to survive, often on a diet that was little more than a whisper of sustenance. Their existence was a brutal cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and praying to uncaring gods for mercy. Then we have the urban poor, the plebs. These weren't the plebeians in the original sense of non-patrician citizens, many of whom were wealthy. No, this was the plebs urbana, the teeming masses crammed into the multi-story fire-trap insulae of Rome and other major cities. Imagine living in a building that was essentially a vertical slum, prone to collapsing, catching fire, or both, often with sanitation that would make a modern sewer system blush. These were the day laborers, the porters, the hawkers, the artisans on the fringe of solvency, the casual workers who woke up each morning with no guarantee of employment, and thus no guarantee of food. Their lives were a relentless hustle, a scramble for odd jobs, a daily negotiation with hunger. Many of them were reliant on the infamous grain dole, the annona, a state-provided allocation of basic grain, primarily designed to keep the city from erupting in riots. It was a lifeline, but a bare-bones one, often requiring hours of queuing and offering little in the way of variety or dignity. Now, a crucial distinction: slaves versus peasants. While their daily struggles might feel blurrily similar in terms of sheer drudgery and diet, there was a fundamental legal difference. Slaves were property, chattel, entirely at the mercy of their owners. Their diet, their work, their very lives were dictated by another. Peasants, even the poorest, generally had some legal standing, however precarious. They might be free citizens, tenants, or small landowners, and thus, theoretically, had rights, though these were often ignored in practice. They could, for instance, be taxed, which was arguably a privilege only afforded to those deemed truly human. However, in terms of the actual nutritional content and variety of their meals, the line between a slave's meager ration and a poor peasant's daily fare could indeed be very blurry, often identical in its drabness. Both were fueled by necessity, not choice. And why did their diet, specifically, matter so much? Because the sheer numbers were staggering. The Roman Empire was not built on a handful of senators and their pet architects. It was built on the backs of millions upon millions of these peasants, however you define them. They were the engine of the empire, the silent, anonymous workforce that made everything else possible. Their caloric intake, however dismal, was the fuel that tilled the fields, hauled the stones, marched the legions, and kept the entire intricate machine of Roman society grinding forward. They were fueled by necessity, by sheer, gut-wrenching hunger, not by gourmet aspirations. Their diet wasn't a choice. It was a testament to survival, a daily battle against the gnawing emptiness that powered one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. So when we talk about what they ate, we're not just discussing food, we're discussing the very bedrock of Roman civilization. All right, let's get to the absolute, undeniable, unescapable foundation of the Roman peasant diet, the unholy trinity: grain, olives, grapes. If you weren't consuming some form of these three things on a daily, if not hourly basis, you probably weren't Roman, or you were already dead. These weren't just common foods, they were the pillars, the absolute bedrock upon which nearly everyone's existence was built, and especially so for the poor. Your life revolved around these three humble, yet indispensable, commodities. Consider first the geographical advantage. The Mediterranean climate, with its long, hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, was practically tailor-made for these specific crops. Wheat, barley, and spelt thrived in the broad, fertile plains. Olive trees, gnarled and ancient, dug their roots deep into the rocky hillsides, shrugging off drought with defiant tenacity. And grapevines, oh the grapevines, clung to every available slope, soaking up the sun's energy to produce their bountiful and often heavily diluted bounty. This wasn't a matter of sophisticated agricultural planning. It was simply what grew abundantly, most of the time, and what had been cultivated in the region for millennia. It was the agricultural path of least resistance, and for the Roman Empire, it was a godsend. And then, the inescapable economic realities. In a world without refrigeration, without complex global supply chains for varied foodstuffs, these three items were simply the most accessible, the cheapest, and the easiest sources of basic calories. Grain could be stored for months, even years, if kept dry. Olives, once pressed into oil, became a versatile fat source that kept well. Grapes, fermented into wine, provided a safer, if mind-numbing, alternative to often contaminated water. These weren't luxury goods, though higher quality versions existed. They were the absolute bottom-shelf, essential foodstuffs that could be produced in bulk, stored, and distributed, keeping the vast majority of the population just above starvation. For a peasant, the choice wasn't about what looked appealing. It was about what kept the wolf from the door and the stomach from outright rebellion. Now, let's talk about the monotony factor. Truly, truly imagine this. Your breakfast, bread and olive oil. Your lunch, bread and olives. Your dinner, grain porridge with a dash of olive oil and maybe some boiled greens, washed down with diluted wine. Day in, day out, season after season, year after year. Your taste buds, bless their ancient, long-suffering souls, would eventually stage a full-blown revolution if they weren't already too busy just trying to send signals of food incoming to your perpetually hungry brain. The sheer grinding repetition of these flavors, earthy grain, pungent olive oil, acidic wine, would strip away any joy from eating. It wasn't a meal. It was a biological imperative. The most exotic flavor you might hope for was a slightly different variety of grain or a particularly well-pressed batch of oil. Your concept of variety would be wildly different from someone who could order a different international cuisine every night of the week. And yet, by ancient, tragic standards, this unholy trinity formed a surprisingly balanced diet. Or rather, it provided basic sustenance and little else. The grains were your carbohydrates, your energy source, your bulk. The olive oil was your primary fat, essential calories, and a delivery mechanism for any fat-soluble vitamins they might have stumbled upon. The grapes, as wine, provided hydration, a few calories, and a mild disinfectant against the often dubious water supply. They offered protein, certainly, and some fiber, but in quantities that left most peasants perpetually teetering on the edge of various deficiency diseases. This wasn't a diet designed for peak athletic performance or intellectual prowess. This was a diet designed for survival. It was a diet that fueled generations of Roman peasants, not with vibrant health, but with just enough energy to get up, go to work, and perpetuate the cycle of grinding existence. So next time you're debating between oat milk and almond milk, spare a thought for the Roman peasant, whose biggest dietary dilemma was likely spelt or barley, and is this olive oil truly rancid or just rustic? If the unholy trinity was the bedrock, then bread, my friends, was the very ground upon which that bedrock rested. This wasn't just a food, it was the food. If you weren't eating bread, you simply weren't eating. It was the staff of life, the caloric cornerstone, the very definition of sustenance. Though, to be brutally honest, it was often a very hard, very coarse, and frequently quite gritty stuff. Imagine a diet where your primary emotional support animal was a loaf of bread. That was Roman peasant life. Now, before you conjure images of crusty artisan loaves from your local bakery, let's talk types of bread. The Roman world had a spectrum, and, like most things, it was directly correlated with your social standing. At one end, for the absurdly wealthy, you had your panis siligeneus, fine white bread made from exquisitely sifted wheat flour. This was the equivalent of today's gluten-free, organic, artisanal, single-origin sourdough, utterly unattainable for the common Roman. It was a symbol of leisure, of refinement, of not having to chew through actual grit. But for the vast majority, the people we are so lovingly dissecting today, their daily bread was something far more earthy. Enter the panis plebeius, or simply plebeian bread. This was the stuff of legend, if legend means a daily struggle with texture and taste. What did it look like? Dark, dense, and probably quite irregular in shape. What did it taste like? Probably regret, dust, and a faint whisper of whatever unidentified organic matter managed to find its way into the dough. It was made from coarse ground flour, often barley or spelt, sometimes a mix of whatever grains were available and cheap. The flour wasn't finely sifted, oh no. This meant it contained significant amounts of bran, bits of husk, and let's not forget the occasional tiny fragments of millstone. Yes, you heard that right. Your daily bread came with a complimentary side of micro-gravel. It added character, apparently, and dental problems. So many dental problems. The millstone's tale is a crucial, if utterly unromantic, part of this story. Before flour could become bread, grains had to be milled. This was an arduous, soul-crushing process, often done by hand using saddle querns or by slaves pushing heavy, donkey-powered rotary mills. Imagine your daily workout. Then imagine that workout was just to get your breakfast ingredients ready. The sound of stone grinding against stone, day in and day out, was the constant soundtrack to ancient life. It was back-breaking, repetitive labor, producing flour that was, by modern standards, incredibly coarse and inconsistent. The poor quality of the milling meant less digestible nutrients, but also that delightful, gritty texture in your finished loaf. It was a labor-intensive endeavor just to get to the starting line of baking. And once you had your questionable flour, how did you get your bread? Well, options varied. Baking at home was possible, but it presented its own challenges. Fuel, typically wood, was precious and often had to be gathered, a time-consuming and exhausting task. Lighting and maintaining a decent oven fire was a significant undertaking. So, for many, especially the urban poor living in crowded insulae with no private ovens, public bakeries were a godsend, or at least a necessity. You'd bring your flour, or buy it pre-ground if you could afford it, to a communal oven, pay a small fee, and pick up your baked loaf later. These bakeries, often visible by their distinctive dome-shaped ovens, were bustling hubs, their air thick with the smell of wood smoke and baking grain. They provided a crucial service, transforming raw, often grimy, ingredients into the daily sustenance that kept the empire running. So, the next time you toast your perfectly sliced, factory-baked bread, spare a thought for the Roman peasant, whose daily bread was a testament to sheer labor, a compromise with quality, and a constant companion in their often grim existence. It wasn't just food, it was survival, ground, baked, and chewed through, one gritty bite at a time. All right, so we've discussed bread, the staff of life. But for the truly destitute, for the people who barely had 2 sesterces to rub together, there was an even more fundamental, even more profoundly unexciting staple: pulse. Forget bread for a moment. Pulse was the true, unsung hero of hunger, the champion of the perpetually underfed, the ultimate in culinary drabness. It predated bread as the primary staple in Rome, and, in terms of sheer blandness and ubiquitous presence, probably outlasted many empires. It was gruel by any other name, and it was glorious in its misery. What, you ask, was this miraculous appetite-suppressing concoction? Pulse was, at its heart, a thick porridge. Think of the blandest, most uninspired oatmeal you've ever choked down, then strip away any pleasant associations of warmth or comfort. It was typically made from various grains: spelt, far, barley, hordeum, sometimes millet, boiled down with water. That's it. Grain, water. Maybe, if you were feeling particularly extravagant, or you just won the ancient lottery, a dash of salt or a trickle of olive oil. It was the ultimate comfort food, if your definition of comfort includes a profound sense of despair and the knowledge that this is, in fact, all you're getting for the foreseeable future. The texture? Gummy, sticky, probably a bit lumpy. The flavor? Earthy, starchy, and aggressively neutral. It was designed to fill, not to delight. Now, for those seeking the gourmet pulse experience, and I use the term gourmet with an entirely straight face if my face were made of stone, there were, shall we say, variations. These were not flavor explosions, mind you, but more like gentle nudges in the direction of slightly less bland. You might encounter pulse fabata, which meant your porridge now included broad beans. Imagine that! Beans! A burst of flavor, certainly, if burst means the subtle, earthy taste of legumes. Or pulse lenticula with lentils. Oh, the excitement! These additions, while simple, were actually critical. They added much-needed protein and fiber, transforming a purely carbohydrate-based dish into something slightly more nutritionally robust. It was the closest the Roman peasant got to a power bowl. Its nutritional value was, well, pragmatic. Starchy, filling, designed to distend a hungry stomach and provide enough slow-release energy to get through another day of back-breaking labor. But in terms of vitamins, minerals, and the kind of vibrant nutrition we associate with modern diets, severely lacking. This was the original bland diet, perfected over centuries, passed down through generations of Romans who learned that sustenance was more important than sensation. It kept them alive, but rarely thriving. It was the food of survival, not vitality. Imagine eating this morning, noon, and night, and then trying to build an empire. It speaks volumes about the sheer, unyielding grit of the Roman people. And culturally, pulse was everywhere. From the earliest Roman legions, who marched and fought fueled by this humble gruel, to the poorest families huddled in their smoke-filled huts, pulse was the universal stomach filler. It was the food of necessity, crossing social divides, though the elite had their pulse too, often with far more decadent additions like cheese, honey, and exotic spices, because of course they did. It was simple to prepare, requiring only grain, water, and a fire, making it accessible even to those with the most basic cooking implements. It was the culinary baseline, the default setting for hunger. So the next time you find yourself staring blankly into your pantry, wondering what to eat, and perhaps complaining about your limited options, remember pulse. And then perhaps give thanks for the glorious, diverse, and often utterly unnecessary culinary landscape of the 21st century. You might even find yourself strangely grateful for that leftover casserole. Now, when we talk about grain, most people default to wheat. And yes, wheat was indeed the preferred grain in Rome, especially for making bread for those who could afford it. But for the Roman peasant, wheat was often a luxury, or simply too expensive, or too difficult to grow in their particular region. So while you might dream of golden wheat fields, the reality for the common folk was often a culinary tour through wheat's less glamorous, often maligned siblings, barley, spelt, and millet. These were the grains of economic necessity, not culinary delight. First up, barley, hordeum. Oh, barley. The hardy, cheap, and undeniably less desirable cousin. It was robust, grew well in poorer soils and harsher climates, and thus was far more accessible for the peasant farmer. But it came with a significant trade-off. Its texture and flavor were generally considered inferior to wheat. It's tougher, coarser, and has a distinct, somewhat bitter, earthy taste. Imagine trying to make a light, fluffy bread out of it. It's a non-starter. So, while the rich enjoyed their fine wheat loaves, the poor often subsisted on barley bread, which was heavy, dense, and possessed a chewiness that would give your jaw a workout. It was the grain of last resort, often fed to animals, pigs, horses, even some slaves, which tells you everything you need to know about its social standing. If you were eating barley bread, you were unequivocally at the bottom of the food chain, physically and gastronomically. It was filling, yes, but in the way that gravel is filling. It takes up space, but doesn't necessarily thrill the palate. Then we have spelt, triticum spelta, or far, as the Romans often called it. This was a common alternative, often favored over barley for pulse and other porridges. Spelt is a more ancient relative of modern wheat, with a tougher husk that requires more processing to remove, but it's also more robust and can grow in less ideal conditions. It was a slightly better option than barley, offering a slightly nuttier flavor and a less aggressive texture. So, if you were lucky, your pulse might be made from spelt, giving you a marginally more palatable experience than its barley-based counterpart. It was a step up, certainly, but still no culinary prize. It was the equivalent of choosing between the cheapest, most industrial white bread and a slightly less industrial whole wheat loaf. Both are still, fundamentally, just bread. And finally, millet, Panicum milliceum. This was a minor crop in the Roman world, but it did have its place, particularly in leaner times or specific regions where it thrived. Millet is a quick-growing grain, offering a faster harvest cycle, which could be crucial when other crops failed. However, it was also low-yielding compared to wheat or barley, meaning you needed a lot of land to get a decent return. It was often used for porridges, sometimes for a very rustic flatbread, or even fed to poultry. Think of it as the filler grain, the emergency ration, the we're desperate option. Its texture is often described as slightly rubbery, and its flavor quite neutral, fading into the background of whatever meager additions you could afford. The regionality of these grains is also fascinating, a testament to how local agriculture and stubborn soil dictated what was available. While Rome itself imported vast quantities of wheat from Egypt and North Africa, local peasant farmers often relied on what grew best in their immediate vicinity. A Roman diet, therefore, was a surprisingly diverse, in its misery, term. A peasant in the harsh uplands might be eating mostly barley and foraged greens, while someone in the fertile plains of Campania might have slightly better access to spelt. The choices were driven by climate, soil, economics, and the ever-present shadow of hunger. So, while the empire spread its influence and its preferred grains, the reality for the common folk was a far more localized, pragmatic, and often less palatable agricultural landscape. It wasn't about gastronomic exploration. It was about getting calories from whatever plant was willing to grow in your particular patch of dirt. All right, if grains were the bulk and olive oil the fat, then legumes, my friends, were the Roman peasants' often desperate attempt at a protein punch. In a world where meat was a mythical creature for the average citizen, where eggs were a rare luxury, and dairy was hit or miss, beans and lentils became the unsung heroes, the humble saviors, the life-sustaining pulse that prevented widespread protein deficiency. If they were lucky enough to get them, that is. First up, the mighty lentil, lens culinaris. These small, disc-shaped powerhouses were highly prized, relatively cheap, and an invaluable source of calories, fiber, and, most critically, protein. They were the closest thing to a superfood the Romans had, long before anyone invented chia seeds or kale smoothies. Lentils were often boiled into a thick, nutritious paste or added to thin, watery stews. Imagine the earthy, slightly peppery flavor, the satisfying texture that actually made you feel like you were eating something substantial. They were digestible, versatile, and could be dried and stored for long periods, making them a year-round staple. For a peasant, a pot of lentil porridge wasn't just a meal. It was a mini victory against starvation. It was the fuel that allowed muscles to repair, bodies to grow, if only a little, and general vitality to persist, however tenuously. Then we have chickpeas, Caesar arietinum. Yes, the very same chickpeas that now grace your hummus bowls and trendy salads. In ancient Rome, they were another common and valuable source of nutrition. Often roasted, probably over an open fire, acquiring a delightful char, or added to stews, chickpeas offered a slightly firmer texture and a more nutty flavor than lentils. They were, in essence, the ancient Roman snack food, if you were feeling particularly bold and had a few to spare. Imagine popping a handful of roasted chickpeas after a long day in the fields. It was probably the closest thing to a satisfying, savory snack a peasant would ever encounter, far removed from the overly processed, sugary delights we take for granted. And let's not forget broad beans, Vicia faba, often simply called fava beans. These were an absolute staple, especially when fresh and green, but just as importantly, dried and stored for winter. They were filling, earthy, and, let's be honest, prone to giving you a rather gassy evening. But for the Roman peasant, a little flatulence was a small price to pay for survival. Broad beans were often added to pulse, creating the aforementioned pulse fabata, or thrown into any thin soup or stew to add bulk and sustenance. They were hearty, cheap, and grew relatively easily, making them a consistent presence in the peasant diet. Their starchy texture and robust flavor made them a satisfying addition, ensuring a meal felt more complete than just grain and water. The preparation of these legumes was, as you might expect, delightfully simple. Boiled, mashed, added to pulse or soups. That was pretty much it. The goal wasn't culinary artistry, it was caloric efficiency. Most legumes were dried for storage, a crucial preservation technique that ensured year-round access to bean-induced flatulence and much-needed protein. Imagine huge sacks of dried lentils and beans, carefully guarded against pests, representing the difference between life and death during the lean winter months. They were a cornerstone of food security. Their importance simply cannot be overstated. Legumes filled the gaping protein gap where meat was almost non-existent for the vast majority of the population. Without them, countless lives would have been lost to slow starvation and the myriad diseases associated with severe malnutrition. They provided the essential amino acids, the complex carbohydrates, and the fiber that kept peasant bodies functioning, albeit suboptimally. They were the quiet heroes of the Roman diet, the unglamorous workhorses that allowed an empire to be built on the very definition of basic sustenance. So, the next time you find yourself turning up your nose at a bowl of lentils, remember their ancient Roman ancestors who would have fought you for that very dish. After the unyielding monotony of grain and legumes, the Roman peasant's diet could sometimes, just sometimes, be brightened by the inclusion of vegetables. This was a slightly more colorful palette, if you squinted hard enough and ignored the general drabness of everything else. But these weren't your vibrant, perfectly manicured supermarket produce. Oh no. These were often hardy, wild, or stubbornly homegrown greens and roots, salvaged from the earth with varying degrees of enthusiasm. So, what exactly was available to the peasant? We're talking about staples like cabbage, which was incredibly versatile and could be eaten raw, boiled, or even fermented. Then there was lettuce, though likely a much tougher, bitter variety than our delicate modern greens. Leeks, onions, and garlic were ubiquitous, providing not just flavor, but also medicinal properties. Or, at least, they were believed to have them. And then there were the wild or semi-wild greens. Mallow, nettles, yes, nettles, often boiled to remove their sting, wild chicory. Root vegetables like beets, turnips, and radishes also made an appearance, providing a starchy, often slightly bitter, bulk. This was a diet of robust, often pungent plants. Wild foraging was an absolutely crucial supplement for the poorest Romans. This was essentially free food, if you knew where to look, and, more importantly, what not to eat. Imagine wandering the edges of fields, along roadsides, or in sparse woodlands, meticulously identifying edible leaves, roots, and berries. It required intimate knowledge of the local flora, passed down through generations. A wrong identification could mean anything from a stomachache to an early, undignified death. So this wasn't just a quaint pastime. It was a desperate, essential skill for survival. It provided much-needed micronutrients, a burst of fresh flavor, and a welcome, albeit temporary, respite from the grain-heavy diet. Even many peasants, both rural and urban, tried to cultivate small garden plots wherever they could. Rural peasants might have a small patch adjacent to their hut. Urban dwellers might attempt to grow something in a cramped courtyard or on a rooftop. A few rows of cabbage, some onions, a hardy herb or two. It was a desperate attempt at self-sufficiency, a way to supplement the grain dole or the meager farm yield. These were not lavish gardens. They were functional, scraggly patches, tended with care and anxiety, hoping to coax a little extra sustenance from the earth. Every green shoot, every tiny radish was a victory. The harsh reality of seasonal availability meant that fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. There were no refrigerated trucks, no global supply chains bringing you strawberries in January. You ate what was in season when it was in season. Spring brought young greens. Summer brought the more robust vegetables. Autumn, the roots and cabbages. Winter, however, was a sad, bland affair. Fresh vegetables were scarce, limited to what could be stored, like dried roots, or what was incredibly hardy. It was a time when the diet became even more reliant on dried grains and legumes, a period of increased nutritional vulnerability. Preparation was, as you might guess, gloriously simple. Boiled, often with a drizzle of olive oil, a splash of vinegar, and perhaps a sprinkle of salt. Sometimes added to thin, watery stews where they'd soften and add a bit of bulk and flavor. The goal was to cook them just enough to be digestible, not to preserve their crispness or delicate flavor profile. Imagine a plate of gray-green boiled cabbage, slightly oily, definitely vinegary. It might not sound appetizing to us, but for a Roman peasant, it was a necessary and welcome component of their daily fight against hunger. These humble vegetables, whether foraged or grown, played a vital role in adding a touch of variety and much-needed vitamins to an otherwise relentlessly monotonous diet. Fruit, the fleeting, glorious, almost fantastical element in the Roman peasant's diet. If vegetables offered a hint of color, then fruits were nature's dessert, a brief, sweet respite from the relentless grain and oil monotony. But like all good things in the ancient world, their availability was entirely at the mercy of the seasons, the whims of the weather, and whether or not you had a tree in your yard or a few pennies to spare at the market. What seasonal delights might a Roman peasant occasionally encounter? Grapes, of course, beyond their liquid, fermented form. Figs, sweet and succulent, often seen as a poor man's delicacy. Apples, pears, plums, cherries. These would make their appearance in the warmer months. Dates, especially imported from North Africa, were a cherished treat, and pomegranates, with their jewel-like seeds, offered a burst of tart sweetness. These were the moments of true culinary joy, savored slowly, appreciated deeply, because they were so rare. Crucially, dried fruits became lifesavers during the long, lean winter months. Figs and dates in particular were perfect for this. They could be harvested, dried in the sun, and stored, providing a concentrated burst of calories and that elusive sweetness when fresh produce was a distant memory. Imagine a peasant chewing on a dried fig in the depths of winter. It wasn't just food, it was a tangible link to the warmth and abundance of summer, a small flicker of hope in the dietary darkness. These were much-needed energy boosters, far superior to yet another bowl of plain pulse. Access to these natural sugars and vitamins for peasants often came from their own small orchards, if they were lucky enough to own a piece of land with a few fruit trees. Or they might forage from wild trees, a risky but rewarding endeavor. Failing that, cheap market stalls might offer surplus fruits, especially after a good harvest, when prices dipped low enough for the poor to afford a small share. It was a gamble, a daily calculation of pennies versus perceived luxury. A truly good harvest might mean a few more days of sweet relief. For most Roman peasants, fruit was the only real dessert they'd regularly encounter. There were no cakes, no pastries, no elaborate sweet dishes like the elite enjoyed. A fresh apple or a handful of dates was the peak of sugary indulgence. It was a true luxury, savored slowly, each bite a precious moment of sensory pleasure. It wasn't about gluttony, it was about genuine appreciation for something beyond the bland necessities. And this brings us to a critical point: the utter lack of sugar in the Roman diet, at least in the refined, granulated form we know today. Cane sugar was a rare and expensive import from India, strictly for the ultra-wealthy. So, honey and fruit provided the only sources of sweetness. This profound absence of refined sugar meant that Roman palates were accustomed to far less intense sweet flavors. What we might find mildly sweet, they would have considered a veritable explosion of sugary delight. It's a stark reminder of the fundamental blandness of life before the sugar revolution, a life where a sun-dried fig was a truly magnificent treat, and a fresh grape was a fleeting, perfect joy. Cherish your chocolate, my friends. Cherish your soda. The Roman peasant knew no such wonders. If grains were the body and legumes the sinews, then olive oil was the lifeblood of the Roman world. It wasn't just food, it was utility, currency, medicine, and a pervasive, often slightly rancid aroma that clung to everything. This was the liquid gold of the poor and the rich and everyone in between. You literally could not escape it. Ubiquitous doesn't even begin to cover it. Olive oil was used for cooking, of course, as the primary fat source, but it was also used for lighting, fueling the lamps that chased away the ancient darkness. It was used for washing, scraped off the skin with a strigil after a bath, acting as both soap and moisturizer. It was a base for medicines and ointments, believed to have healing properties. And yes, it was used for lubrication, for machinery, for hinges, for whatever needed a good greasing. It wasn't just a condiment, it was life, literally. And if you've ever been near an ancient olive press, you'll know it came with a faint, persistent smell of, well, olives. and perhaps a hint of fermentation that bordered on rancidity. The production of olive oil was a manual, laborious affair. Olives, harvested by hand or by beating the trees with long poles, were crushed in massive stone presses, often powered by animals or slaves. It was a messy, intense industry, transforming the humble fruit into this liquid gold. Different presses, different methods, and different timings resulted in various grades of oil. It was a significant industry, involving vast groves, specialized equipment, and legions of workers. And here's where social status reared its oily head yet again. Just like bread, not all olive oil was created equal. The very best, the freshest, the extra virgin, though they didn't use that exact term, the concept was there, was reserved for the elite. This was the stuff of delicate flavors, often used as a finishing oil. For the poor, however, it was a different story. Their olive oil was often of a lower grade, pressed from olives that might be overripe or even slightly spoiled, and stored in less ideal conditions. Extra virgin? You were lucky if it was just virgin and not already divorced from freshness, perhaps several times over. It was often thicker, cloudier, and prone to going rancid more quickly, imparting a strong, sometimes harsh flavor to everything it touched. But it was cheap, it was caloric, and it served its purpose. Its role in the peasant diet was paramount. It was the primary fat source, absolutely essential for energy and satiety in a diet otherwise dominated by carbohydrates. It was added to almost everything: pulse, stews, boiled vegetables, bread. It provided calories, flavor, even if it was a strong, slightly off-putting flavor, and lubrication down the gullet. Without olive oil, the Roman peasant diet would have been even more incredibly bleak and nutritionally inadequate. It was the energy boost, the flavor enhancer, the caloric glue that held the diet together. The logistics of storage and trade were immense. Olive oil was stored and transported in distinctive ceramic amphorae, vast quantities moving across the Mediterranean, greasing the wheels of trade and nourishing the empire. Huge olive groves, particularly in regions like Hispania Baetica, modern-day Andalusia, were dedicated to feeding Rome's insatiable appetite for oil. This wasn't just about food. It was about infrastructure, trade routes, and the intricate supply chains that kept the entire Roman world functioning. So, next time you drizzle a little olive oil on your salad, remember its ancient ancestor, the pervasive, essential, often slightly questionable liquid gold that fueled an empire, one greasy meal at a time. After a day of grinding labor and even more grinding pulse, the Roman peasant turned to wine. Not because they were connoisseurs or even particularly fond of the taste, but because wine was the common drink, a daily necessity masquerading as pleasure. In a world where water was often a gamble with your intestines, diluted wine was the norm for hydration. It was a lifeline, a cultural staple, and a fleeting escape from the relentless drudgery of existence. Let's be clear. We're not talking about your fine vintage Pinot Noir or a delicate Chianti. Oh no. The quality of peasant wine was, shall we say, utterly unpretentious. Think whatever was cheap, didn't immediately kill you, and was vaguely grape-flavored. It was often thin, acidic, and prone to spoiling, especially if not stored well. Forget notes of oak or blackberry. You were lucky if you didn't detect notes of mildly fermented regret or the bottom of a dirty barrel. It was often the cheapest local swill, probably produced in vast quantities with little care for refinement. The goal was alcohol content and accessibility, not aromatic complexity. It was about practicality, not pleasure, though a little buzz certainly helped soften the edges of reality. And then we have Pascha. Pascha, the Roman peasants' energy drink, the ultimate acidic refresher, the drink that truly encapsulated ancient thriftiness. This was watered-down wine mixed with vinegar. Yes, vinegar, you heard that right. Imagine the tang, the aggressive acidity, the immediate puckering sensation in your mouth. Truly refreshing if you happen to hate your taste buds and enjoy an acidic tang that could strip paint. But Pascha was more than just a punishment for your palate. It was a practical solution. The vinegar further disinfected the dubious water, and the slight alcoholic content, even if heavily diluted, provided a bit of energy. It was cheap, it was common, and it was the standard fare for legions on the march and laborers in the fields. A modern sports drink has nothing on the sheer, no-nonsense functionality of Pascha. Beyond hydration, wine played a profound social role. It was a mild intoxicant, a part of the daily ritual, a fleeting escape. After a back-breaking day, a few cups of diluted wine could dull the aches, lift the spirits, and provide a temporary reprieve from the harsh realities of peasant life. It wasn't about getting roaring drunk every night, though that certainly happened sometimes. It was about that gentle buzz, that slight softening of the world's sharp edges. It fostered camaraderie, helped forge bonds, and made the unbearable just a little bit more bearable. It was liquid therapy, albeit very cheap, very rough liquid therapy. The production was either homegrown, if you were fortunate enough to have a small vineyard or even just a few grapevines, or cheap purchases from local vineyards. Larger estates produced vast quantities of wine, much of it of lower quality, destined for the common market. The bigger the vineyard, the more industrial the process, and often, the worse the wine tasted. Small-scale producers might offer slightly better, more artisanal, though still far from refined options, but these were likely more expensive. Wine wasn't just a drink, it was an agricultural product, a major industry, and a fundamental component of the Roman peasants' often grim existence. So, raise your glass, of whatever dubious liquid you prefer, to the Roman peasant, who found solace and questionable hydration in a cup of watered-down, vinegar-tinged grape juice. We've talked about wine as the common drink, often because the alternative, water, was frequently a risky essential. In the Roman world, obtaining clean, safe drinking water was less a guarantee and more a daily game of Russian roulette with your digestive system. You needed it to survive, but every sip carried a silent, invisible threat. Sources were varied and often precarious. Rivers provided water, but they were also convenient dumping grounds for human and animal waste. Wells could tap into cleaner groundwater, but were easily contaminated by surface runoff, especially in densely populated areas. Cisterns collected rainwater, which could be relatively clean, but they too were prone to contamination from birds, insects, and accumulated debris. And public fountains, those glorious feats of engineering found in Roman cities, were a godsend for those lucky enough to live near one and robust enough to fight for access. But even they weren't foolproof. Lead pipes could leach into the water, and the sheer volume of users meant potential contamination was always lurking. Safety concerns were paramount, even if the ancient Romans didn't fully grasp germ theory. They certainly understood that certain water made people sick, Contamination from human and animal waste was a constant threat, leading to rampant outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases. It was a constant coin toss between dehydration and, shall we say, an extremely explosive trip to the latrine. For the Roman peasant, especially in crowded urban centers or remote rural areas without reliable springs, every drink was a calculated risk. The aqueducts, those glorious feats of Roman engineering that still stand today, were indeed magnificent. They brought vast quantities of fresh, clean water from distant springs and rivers into the major cities. But this was primarily for the urban elite, public baths, and the most densely populated areas. The truly poor, especially those living on the fringes of cities or in rural areas, often had limited or no access to these pristine supplies. And even for those who did, the aqueduct system wasn't always perfectly maintained. Lead pipes, cracked channels, and deliberate sabotage could all compromise the water quality. The grandeur of the aqueducts often masked a more granular reality of inadequate, unsafe water for the common folk. Boiling was a known method of purification, a practical solution to kill off those invisible nasties. However, it was also an energy-intensive method. Fuel, wood, charcoal, dried dung was precious and had to be gathered or bought. For a peasant constantly on the edge of subsistence, the cost in labor and resources to boil all their drinking water might have been prohibitive, a luxury foregone in favor of just taking the risk. Survival often meant making tough, potentially deadly choices. And this, my friends, brings us back to the necessity of diluting wine. Part of it was cultural. Everyone did it. But a very practical part of it was surely a rudimentary form of public health. The alcohol in wine, even diluted, acted as a mild disinfectant, killing off some of the pathogens present in the water. The acidity of Pascha would have done an even better job. So what seemed like a cultural preference for weaker wine was also a pragmatic response to the ever-present threat of a truly nasty stomach bug. The Roman peasant's relationship with water was a complicated dance between vital need and existential dread, making every sip a reminder of the fragility of ancient life. All right, let's talk about meat. Or more accurately, let's talk about the profound, soul-crushing absence of meat in the Roman peasant's diet. For most of the common folk, meat was not a regular meal. It was a mythical creature, a whisper of luxury, a feast for the few, and an unattainable dream for the many. Your monthly, or more likely yearly, protein allowance usually coincided with a festival or an extraordinarily fortunate happenstance. The extreme rarity of meat meant that if you were a peasant, you rarely tasted it. The idea of a steak, a roast, or even a humble chicken drumstick on your plate every week was as fantastical as owning your own personal chariot. Meat was an investment, a sign of wealth, and a symbol of status. For those at the bottom, it was simply out of reach. Your protein came from legumes, from some of those grimy grains, and from the sheer, unyielding force of your own desperation. So, where did the rare morsel of meat come from? If you lived in a rural area bordering uncultivated land, wild game might be a source, if you could hunt it, that is, without getting caught by a wealthy landowner's gamekeeper, or, worse, eaten by whatever you were trying to hunt. Small birds, rabbits, wild boar, these were all possibilities, but required skill, luck, and the willingness to break a few laws. Domestic animals, chickens, pigs, goats, sheep, were raised, but primarily for their eggs, milk, wool, or labor, not typically for slaughter, unless they were old, sick, or there was a very special occasion. A pig was a walking savings account, too valuable to just eat on a whim. The most common, and arguably most reliable way for the poor to get meat was through sacrificial rituals. Praise the gods for their generosity, and your empty stomach for its desperation. After a public sacrifice to the gods, the edible portions of the animal, often the less desirable cuts or the organs, would be distributed to the masses. Imagine the scene: a religious festival, the smell of burning incense and animal fat, and then the orderly, or perhaps not so orderly, distribution of chunks of sacrificial beef or pork. For a peasant, this was a rare, joyous occasion, a sudden, unexpected influx of precious animal protein. It wasn't about piety, it was about protein. Among domestic animals, pork was relatively common, but still an investment. A pig was a valuable resource, providing fat, rendered into lard, meat, and a way to dispose of household scraps. Raising a pig could sustain a family for a while, making it a valuable asset, not a casual meal. Slaughtering a pig was a significant event, often done communally, ensuring that every part was used. It was a feast, not a Tuesday night dinner. Small animals provided other, more irregular sources of meat. Chickens, if you could raise them without them being stolen or eaten by predators, provided eggs more regularly than meat. Pigeons, often nesting in public buildings or under eaves, could be caught. Hares and other small rodents were also fair game, if you could catch them without angering your landlord, who probably owned the hunting rights. These were supplementary sources, a desperate attempt to add any kind of animal protein to an otherwise vegetarian existence. The Roman peasants' relationship with meat was one of longing, of rarity, and of seizing any opportunity that came their way. A meal with meat was not just food, it was a celebration, a minor miracle, a brief, glorious escape from the endless cycle of grain. While meat was a distant dream for most Roman peasants, fish offered a slightly more attainable, albeit often equally unglamorous, source of animal protein, especially for those with the good fortune to live near a coastline or a major river. This was the sea's bounty, a lifeline for those with fishing skills, and sometimes a veritable stink bomb for everyone else. For peasants living near the sea or major rivers, fish was indeed more common. These communities developed local fishing industries, harvesting the abundant, at the time, marine and freshwater life. Small, bony fish, eels, often a staple in river communities, and various shellfish were all part of the local diet. These weren't the prized, large specimens destined for the elite's banquets. They were the everyday catches, the ones that were plentiful and cheap. Imagine the salty tang in the air, the calls of fishmongers, the constant reminder of the sea's presence, and its sometimes dubious gifts. Preservation was, as always, key to extending the reach and shelf life of this perishable commodity. Drying and salting were the primary methods, transforming fresh fish into a non-perishable, if somewhat less appetizing form. This allowed fish to be transported inland, ensuring that the pervasive smell of fish could travel far and wide, even to communities distant from the coast. Salted fish, often dried and hard as rock, needed to be rehydrated and cooked, but it provided crucial protein during the lean months when fresh food was scarce. It was an acquired taste, certainly, but a taste of survival nonetheless. And then we come to the great, the infamous, the utterly pervasive garum. Oh, garum. This fermented fish sauce was not just a condiment, it was an institution, a culinary cornerstone, the ancient Roman equivalent of ketchup, soy sauce, and probably a few other things you don't want to think about. It was made by fermenting fish, often small, oily fish like anchovies or sprats, with large quantities of salt in open vats under the scorching sun for weeks or months. The result was a pungent, salty, umami-rich liquid that was absolutely everywhere. It was added to virtually every dish, from the simplest pulse to the most elaborate elite banquets. The ubiquity of garum meant that even the poorest peasant likely encountered it. While the finest grades were expensive, cheaper, lower-quality garum was produced in vast quantities and was widely accessible. Its pervasive, and often pungent, aroma would have hung over Roman towns and cities, especially near the garum factories, which were notorious for their stench. It wasn't just a flavor enhancer, it was a cheap source of salt and sometimes even a little extra protein. It was the taste of Rome, a taste often described as savory, sometimes fishy, and always salty. The stink of poverty, quite literally, was often associated with fish. The fish markets, the garum factories, the drying racks, all contributed to a particular olfactory landscape. This pervasive smell of fish and fermentation was a constant reminder of coastal life, of the sea's bounty, and of the fundamental role of fish in the diet of many Romans, especially the poor. It might not have been a pleasant aroma, but it was the smell of sustenance, the scent of survival. So, next time you contemplate adding a dash of fish sauce to your stir-fry, spare a thought for the Roman peasant, whose life, and much of whose diet, was utterly saturated with the glorious, pungent essence of fermented fish. Let's delve into dairy, a somewhat more nuanced and geographically variable component of the Roman peasant diet. Unlike the ubiquity of grain, olive oil, and wine, milk and cheese weren't universally consumed daily staples for every Roman peasant. Their presence on the peasant's table often depended on whether they, or their neighbors, practiced a pastoral life. Milk, for instance, was primarily consumed by those who were actually raising animals, goats, sheep, or, less commonly for peasants, cows. It wasn't a universal staple because of a significant practical problem: its limited shelf life. In a world without refrigeration, fresh milk quickly soured and spoiled, especially in the warm Mediterranean climate. This meant that if you didn't own the animal and milk it yourself, or live within spitting distance of someone who did, fresh milk was a rare commodity. It certainly wasn't available in neat cartons at a corner store. So, while a rural family with a few goats might have access to fresh goat's milk, an urban peasant would find it virtually impossible to come by. Cheese, however, was a different story. Cheese was far more common due to its superior preservation qualities. Hard, salty cheeses, often made from sheep or goat's milk, were transportable, lasted much longer than fresh milk, and provided a concentrated source of fat and protein. Imagine a dry, crumbly, intensely salty cheese. Not exactly gourmet brie, but highly functional. These cheeses were a valuable addition to the diet, especially during winter months when other fresh foods were scarce. They could be grated into pulse, eaten with bread and olives, or simply gnawed on for a burst of flavor and calories. Sour milk or yogurt-like products were also a possibility in certain regions, particularly among pastoralist communities who understood the art of fermentation. This wasn't the sweet, fruit-filled yogurt of today, but a tangy, thick, naturally fermented product that was more digestible for many adults, who were often lactose intolerant, as dairy consumption wasn't widespread enough to select for lactose tolerance in the population. These products would have provided beneficial probiotics, though the Romans wouldn't have understood the science behind it. They just knew it was food that didn't spoil as quickly and settled the stomach. The regionality of dairy consumption was key. It was far more prevalent in areas with strong pastoral traditions, regions where sheep and goats were extensively raised, such as parts of Italy's uplands, Greece, or Gaul. In regions primarily focused on grain agriculture, dairy was less common, simply because the animals weren't as integral to the economy or the daily life. So, while a peasant in a mountainous area might have cheese as a regular part of their diet, a peasant in a flat, grain-growing region might rarely encounter it. Its role in the overall diet was important, but usually as a supplement rather than a primary calorie source. Dairy products added much-needed protein and fat, contributing to the overall nutritional profile, especially when meat was scarce. It was a caloric boost, a way to add satiety and flavor to an otherwise bland meal. But it wasn't the daily bread. It was the occasional accompaniment, the valuable extra that made a lean meal just a little less lean. So, while the Roman peasant didn't have a wide selection of milk alternatives or artisanal cheeses, they made good use of what dairy they could get their hands on, proving that even a hard, salty chunk of goat cheese could be a small culinary victory in the grand scheme of ancient survival. In the persistent quest for protein and calories, eggs presented a valuable, relatively easy-to-obtain source for the Roman peasant, provided they had a bird or were particularly adept at illicit egg acquisition. They were a small, self-contained package of nutrition, a quiet workhorse of the ancient diet, often overlooked in the grander narratives of grain and olive oil. Poultry was the primary source, of course. Chickens were the most common, but geese and ducks were also raised. These birds were kept primarily for their eggs, a continuous, renewable resource that didn't require slaughtering the animal, unless, of course, the bird was old, sick, or you were truly desperate for meat, which was a very rare occasion. Imagine a small, scruffy coop next to a peasant's hut. A few hens scratching in the dirt, their daily offerings a small but significant contribution to the family's survival. Eggs were a predictable source of sustenance, a small victory against the capricious nature of the harvest. Wild birds also offered a chance for eggs, though this was a riskier venture. Foraging for eggs in wild nests was a seasonal activity, requiring sharp eyes and often a bit of daring. Stealing from nests, whether wild or from a neighbor's unsuspecting coop, was a clear act of survival for the truly desperate. It was food, pure and simple, and moral niceties often took a back seat to a rumbling stomach. Imagine scrambling up a tree or poking around a thorny bush, hoping for a clutch of tiny, precious eggs. It was a gamble, but one that could pay off handsomely in terms of vital nutrients. Preparation was, as you might expect, delightfully straightforward. Eggs were boiled, perhaps scrambled, though likely a rougher, simpler version than your fluffy modern scramble, or added to other dishes, like thin stews or vegetable mashes, to enhance their nutritional value and flavor. They cooked quickly, making them an ideal food for a busy peasant with limited fuel and time. Simple, versatile, and requiring minimal culinary skill, eggs were the ultimate convenience food of the ancient world. Their importance was significant. Eggs were a valuable and relatively accessible source of protein, fat, and a host of vitamins and minerals. For families who managed to keep a few hens, they provided a consistent supply of these crucial nutrients, filling dietary gaps where meat was absent and legumes might be scarce. They were a small but mighty contributor to the daily calorie count, helping to prevent the worst effects of malnutrition. A single egg could make a basic meal feel significantly more substantial and nourishing. However, eggs were not a year-round constant. Seasonal availability was a factor, as birds naturally laid fewer eggs during the colder, darker winter months. This meant that while eggs might be plentiful in spring and summer, they would become a much rarer commodity in autumn and winter, further exacerbating the dietary challenges of the lean season. So, while a clutch of fresh eggs was always a welcome sight, their presence was a fleeting luxury, a reminder that even the simplest protein sources were subject to the whims of nature. The Roman peasant looked at an egg not as a breakfast choice, but as a small, perfect sphere of survival. Let's talk about something truly revelatory about the Roman peasant's diet: the complete and utter absence of sugar. That's right, my friends. The concept of granulated cane sugar, that glorious, ubiquitous, white crystalline substance that now permeates nearly every foodstuff known to humankind, was simply unknown to them. Life, for the Romans, was literally less sweet. Imagine that. No candy bars, no sugary sodas, no pastries loaded with frosting. Their palates, therefore, were conditioned to a far more primitive, less intense, and frankly, less delightful range of sweet flavors. Honey was the undisputed king of sweeteners. For millennia, it had been the primary source of concentrated sweetness in the Mediterranean world, and Rome was no exception. However, for peasants, honey was often expensive, unless they were fortunate enough to keep their own bees. Beekeeping was an ancient art, requiring skill, time, and a bit of bravery, but it could provide a family with a precious commodity. For those who didn't keep bees, honey was a luxury, purchased at the market, used sparingly, perhaps only for special occasions or medicinal purposes. It was a precious commodity, a thick, golden delight, valued not just for its sweetness, but also for its perceived health benefits and its preservative qualities. Imagine drizzling a tiny amount of honey over a bowl of pulse. That was the closest a peasant might get to a gourmet dessert. Dates were another incredibly important source of sweetness and calories. Often imported from North Africa and the Near East, dates, especially dried ones, were widely available and relatively affordable. They were energy-dense, portable, and offered a natural, robust sweetness that could satisfy cravings. Dried dates were a crucial component of winter survival, providing essential calories and a much-needed touch of sweetness when fresh fruits were long gone. They could be eaten as a snack, added to porridges, or even used in rudimentary baking, though for peasants, baking usually meant making more bread. A handful of dates was a small, satisfying pleasure, a taste of distant, exotic lands, even if the peasant had never left their village. And then there was grape must, or defrutum, or sapa. This was essentially boiled down grape juice, concentrated into a thick, syrupy consistency. It served a dual purpose, as a sweetener and as a preservative. Imagine a natural grape syrup, but more aggressively grape-flavored, and sometimes, worryingly, lead-contaminated, as lead pots were sometimes used for the boiling process, a subtle health hazard they were entirely unaware of. Defrutum was used to sweeten dishes, in rich sauces, and even as a general condiment. It offered a tangy, concentrated sweetness that was distinct from honey, a taste of the vineyard, captured in a viscous liquid. The scarcity of sweetness fundamentally shaped the Roman peasants' culinary experience. Life was generally less sweet, both literally and figuratively. This meant that any sweet treat, however humble, was a rare and deeply appreciated luxury. A fresh fig, a handful of grapes, a tiny dollop of honey, these were moments of genuine indulgence, savored slowly and remembered. It reminds us just how profoundly our modern diets, saturated with sugar, have altered our palates. The Roman peasant existed in a world where true sweetness was a precious, fleeting gift, making every sweet morsel a small victory against the prevailing blandness. It puts your daily sugar craving into a rather stark historical perspective, doesn't it? If sweetness was a rare luxury, salt was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity. It wasn't just a flavor enhancer. It was the ancient preservative par excellence, a critical component for basic human health and an indispensable tool for making bland peasant food, well, bearable. Without salt, the Roman diet, and indeed life itself, would have been profoundly different and far, far shorter. Its necessity cannot be overstated. For preserving food, salt was king. Meat was salted, fish was salted, often heavily, as in the case of garum, and some vegetables were brined. This allowed food to be stored for extended periods, crucial for surviving the lean winter months and ensuring a year-round food supply. Imagine a world where your only reliable freezer was a pile of salt. It was also vital for basic human health. Electrolytes, nerve function, fluid balance all require sodium. In a physically demanding, often dehydrating agrarian life, salt was essential to prevent fatigue, muscle cramps, and other debilitating conditions. And, perhaps most importantly for the peasant, it was crucial for making inherently bland food edible, cutting through the monotony of grain and making it palatable. Sources of salt varied. Coastal regions relied on salt pans, where seawater was evaporated by the sun, leaving behind crystalline deposits. Inland areas accessed rock salt mines, laboriously extracting the precious mineral from the earth. The control of these sources was often a point of imperial power and economic leverage. Rome understood that he who controlled the salt controlled a crucial aspect of survival. Indeed, the trade and control of salt were of paramount importance to the Roman state. It was a strategic commodity, sometimes even taxed heavily. The famous Via Salaria, or Salt Road, stretching from Rome to the Adriatic coast, underscores its immense importance. This wasn't just a road for any old cargo. It was specifically designed to transport salt, linking the capital to its vital supply. Its very existence is a testament to the value placed on this seemingly simple mineral. Salt wasn't just a commodity, it was a geopolitical asset. Its value was often literally worth its weight in, well, salt. Soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given an allowance to buy it, which is where the word salary purportedly derives. This wasn't because it was a luxury. It was because it was absolutely crucial for survival, for keeping legions marching and populations alive. For a peasant, being able to afford enough salt for their family was a fundamental part of household economy. It was the cheapest, most effective preservative available, far more crucial than any exotic spice. And for flavoring, salt was indispensable. Imagine a diet predominantly of boiled grains and vegetables. The addition of salt transformed these otherwise insipid dishes into something with at least some discernible taste. It made the pulse edible, the vegetables less bitter, the dried fish less offensive. It was the simplest, most fundamental flavor enhancer, the one thing that could elevate utter blandness to mere blandness. The Roman peasant's flavor palette was simple, often relying on sour, vinegar, fatty, olive oil, and, most critically, salty notes. There were no intricate spice blends here, just a desperate desire for something, anything, to break the monotony. So the next time you sprinkle salt over your food, give a silent nod to the Roman peasant, whose life, quite literally, depended on it. Having established that salt was a necessity, let's pivot to herbs, spices, and condiments. For the Roman peasant, this category was less about an explosion of exotic flavors and more about making their relentlessly simple diet marginally more palatable. It was about small luxuries, the occasional burst of something fragrant, a fleeting hint of complexity in a world dominated by basic tastes. Local herbs were the peasants' primary foray into flavor. Rosemary, thyme, oregano, mint, rue, dill, these were either foraged from the wild or grown in tiny, precious garden plots. They were used sparingly, certainly not with the lavish abandon of an elite chef, but their impact was vital. A few sprigs of mint in a thin stew, a pinch of oregano on a piece of bread, a bit of garlic mashed into vegetables. These additions elevated the ordinary, adding a touch of freshness and aroma. Imagine the subtle, earthy scent of wild thyme, a familiar and comforting aroma in an otherwise stark culinary landscape. These were the herbs of the land, easily accessible and profoundly appreciated. Exotic spices, however, were a different story entirely. Pepper, cumin, coriander, saffron, these were the domain of the wealthy, traded over vast distances, incredibly expensive, and primarily destined for the elite's ostentatious banquets. If a peasant had pepper, they were either robbing someone, had inherited a bizarre and incredibly valuable family heirloom, or had simply mistaken it for dirt. The idea of using pepper to season their pulse would have been laughable, bordering on sacrilegious. These spices were status symbols, not culinary tools for the masses. Their presence indicated immense wealth and access to global trade networks, things far removed from the peasants' daily struggle. And then, garum, again. Yes, that infamous fermented fish sauce. It simply cannot be overstated how ubiquitous this condiment was. Even if it smelled like questionable decisions and fermenting fish, it was everywhere. It was the ultimate Roman flavor enhancer, providing that intense, salty umami kick. From the lowliest peasant to the most opulent senator, garum graced almost every table. It was cheap enough in its lowest grades to be accessible, and its powerful flavor could transform even the most insipid dish. It was the ancient Roman MSG, a flavor bomb that cut through blandness and unified the palate of an entire empire. Mustard and vinegar were also common additions for flavor and acidity. Mustard was easily cultivated, providing a pungent kick. Vinegar, often made from soured wine, was cheap and readily available, adding a sharp, tangy note that could brighten dull dishes and aid in digestion. It was used in everything from dressings for boiled greens to the aforementioned pasca. These were simple, local, and incredibly effective flavor agents, far more accessible than any exotic spice. The peasant's flavor palette was, therefore, simple and robust. It relied heavily on sour, vinegar, salty, garum, salt, and a few strong, pungent local herbs and aromatics like garlic and onion. There were no intricate spice blends, no delicate flavor pairings, no subtle nuances. It was about making food edible, providing a burst of strong flavor to mask the underlying monotony and ensuring that every calorie counted. These small luxuries, these simple additions, were a testament to human ingenuity in making the best of a decidedly unglamorous culinary situation. They didn't have much, but what they had, they used to great effect, however rudimentary. Having gathered their meager ingredients, the Roman peasant then faced the daily challenge of cooking them. And let me tell you, this was no elegant culinary endeavor involving gleaming copper pots and perfectly calibrated ovens. Oh no. The peasant's hearth was a smoky, often unsanitary, and utterly primitive workspace, a constant battle against smoke inhalation, fuel scarcity, and basic thermodynamics. The open fire was the primary, often the only, cooking method. Imagine a simple pit or a raised platform of stones in the middle of a small, windowless hut. That was your kitchen. Food was cooked directly over the flames or in pots suspended above them. Smoke management was often non-existent. The smoke would simply rise, fill the dwelling, and eventually find its way out through the thatch roof or a crude opening. This meant that peasant homes were perpetually smoke-filled, leading to chronic respiratory issues, stinging eyes, and a pervasive smoky aroma that clung to clothes, hair, and everything within the dwelling. You didn't just smell like a peasant, you smelled like a smoked peasant. Utensils were simple, functional, and often shared. Clay pots were the most common, cheap, locally made, but fragile and prone to breaking. Bronze cauldrons, if a family owned one, were a significant investment, often passed down through generations, representing a valuable piece of household wealth. Basic iron knives were used for cutting, again, often a personal tool rather than a communal kitchen implement. There were no whisks, no spatulas, no specialized cooking gadgets, just basic, durable, often soot-covered tools for stirring, boiling, and chopping. The lack of chimneys, as mentioned, was a defining feature. Wealthier homes might have flues, but for the vast majority, smoke was simply an inescapable part of daily life. This constant exposure to wood smoke wasn't just an inconvenience. It had serious health implications. Lung diseases, eye infections, and chronic coughing would have been rampant. It was the price of a hot meal, a constant reminder of the primitive nature of their living conditions. Fuel scarcity was another major hurdle. Wood was precious. It had to be gathered, often from distant forests or scrubland, a time-consuming and exhausting chore, usually relegated to women and children. This scarcity meant that fuel was used sparingly, and fires were rarely kept burning continuously. For many, dung, dried animal manure, or brushwood, small twigs, leaves, whatever combustible material could be scavenged, were often used, adding to the delightful, smoky, earthy, and sometimes vaguely fecal aroma of peasant homes. Imagine the subtle bouquet of cow dung and boiled cabbage. Culinary heaven. Meal preparation itself was a laborious, time-consuming daily ritual. It often fell to the women of the household, starting early in the morning and ending late at night. Fetching water, collecting fuel, grinding grain, if done at home, preparing vegetables, and tending the fire. It was a never-ending cycle of domestic labor, all for the sake of getting a simple, often bland, meal onto the table. It wasn't just about cooking. It was about the sheer, relentless effort required to put food in front of a hungry family, day after day, year after year, in conditions that would make a modern glamping trip feel like a five-star resort. The peasant's hearth was more than a cooking area. It was the heart of their struggle, the engine of their survival, perpetually wreathed in smoke and the smell of boiled grain. For the Roman peasant, meal timings were not dictated by trendy intermittent fasting schedules or the desire for a leisurely brunch. Oh no, they were dictated by the sun, the arduous demands of labor, and the incessant growl of an empty stomach. Eating was a functional act, a necessity for survival, a rhythm that punctuated a day defined by toil. Breakfast, or ientaculum, was a simple, no-fuss affair. This wasn't a lavish spread with eggs and bacon. Far from it. It was often leftovers from the night before, perhaps a piece of stale bread dipped in olive oil, or, if you were really pushing the boat out, diluted wine. It was more of a calorie preload, a quick refuel before the day's back-breaking work began. Imagine gnawing on a piece of hard, day-old bread, washing it down with some questionable wine, all before the sun had fully risen. It was a utilitarian start to a utilitarian day, designed to provide just enough energy to get the body moving, nothing more. Lunch, or prandium, was equally light and quick. It was typically eaten on the go, in the fields, or wherever work demanded. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a sad desk lunch, but without the desk, or the sadness, because you were too hungry to feel anything but the need for calories. Bread was, again, the cornerstone. Perhaps with a piece of hard cheese, a handful of olives, or, if available, a few dried fruits. It was a fleeting pause in the day's labor, a pragmatic refuel to prevent mid-afternoon collapse. There were no lunch breaks with colleagues, no elaborate discussions over panini, just a quick, solitary bite to keep the engine running. Dinner, or cena, was the main meal of the day, the one substantial event in the peasant's culinary calendar. This usually took place after sunset, when the day's work was finally done and the family could gather. This was when the pulse would make its grand and inevitable appearance, perhaps accompanied by a thin, watery stew, boiled vegetables, or whatever meager additions were available. It was the biggest meal, designed to replenish spent energy reserves and sustain them through the long night until intanaculone once more. It was a communal affair, often eaten around the open hearth, a moment of shared sustenance and brief respite. Crucially, there was no snacking culture for the Roman peasant. Food was too precious, too hard-won, to be wasted on frivolous bites between meals. Every calorie counted, and every morsel was consumed with purpose. The idea of reaching for a bag of chips or a cookie between meals would have been utterly alien, an unthinkable waste of vital resources. Eating was a structured, disciplined act driven by the need for survival. The rhythm of the day, therefore, was intrinsically dictated by labor, the sun, and the persistent growl of an empty stomach. Meals weren't about indulgence. They were checkpoints in the arduous journey of survival. They were functional, brief interludes in a life of continuous toil. This regimented eating schedule, devoid of culinary pleasure, perfectly encapsulated the peasant's existence. A relentless cycle of hard work, minimal reward, and just enough food to keep the body going. So, the next time you mindlessly reach for a mid-morning snack, spare a thought for the Roman peasant, who would have considered your casual munching an act of unthinkable, decadent waste. In a world before refrigerators, freezers, or even hermetically sealed containers, food preservation was not just a clever trick, it was the ultimate battle against the rot, the relentless fight to keep starvation at bay during the lean seasons. For the Roman peasant, mastering these techniques was paramount. a skill passed down through generations, representing the difference between life and death. Drying was perhaps the most fundamental and widespread method. Grains, legumes, fruits, and even some vegetables were all subjected to the merciless sun and wind. Imagine fields of harvested wheat, carefully spread out to dry, or figs laid out on mats until all their moisture was leached away. This ancient art of removing all joy and moisture from food effectively halted the growth of spoilage microorganisms, allowing food to be stored for months, even years. It transformed perishable produce into a stable, if often less palatable, commodity. It was simple, low-tech, and incredibly effective, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of nature's relentless decay. Salting and brining were critical, especially for meat and fish. As we've discussed, meat was rare, but when it was available, or when fish was caught in abundance, salt was used extensively to cure it. Large quantities of salt would be rubbed into meat or fish, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. This allowed these precious protein sources to last far beyond their natural lifespan, providing vital sustenance during the winter months. Imagine sides of heavily salted pork or dried, briny fish hung up to cure, looking more like leather than food, but representing a caloric goldmine. This technique was a cornerstone of winter survival, albeit one that resulted in intensely salty, often tough, food that required rehydration and careful cooking. Smoking was another method, primarily for meats, especially pork. Beyond preservation, smoking also imparted a distinct flavor profile. Hams and other cuts would be hung in smokehouses or simply near a perpetually smoky peasant hearth to absorb the smoke from burning wood. This process dried the meat further and infused it with compounds that deterred spoilage and added a rich, earthy taste. It was a method that, unfortunately, used precious fuel, but for preserving a valuable pig, it was a worthwhile investment. The resulting smoked meats were a rare treat, a testament to careful planning and foresight. Pickling offered another solution for vegetables. Submerging vegetables in vinegar or brine created an acidic environment hostile to bacteria, extending their shelf life considerably. Cabbage, turnips, and other hardy vegetables could be preserved this way, offering a sour, tangy component to the diet during the bleak winter. It provided a different flavor profile, a welcome acidity to cut through the general blandness, and ensured some vegetable intake year-round. Storage itself was a constant challenge against pests, mold, and thieves. Amphorae, large ceramic jars, smaller ceramic pots, woven baskets, and wooden chests were all used. Grains were stored in granaries, hopefully rodent-proof, or in underground pits. But these were simple, imperfect methods. Pests, insects, mice, rats, were a constant threat, capable of devouring or contaminating vast quantities of food. Mold and dampness were also ever-present dangers. Every stored morsel was a victory against the forces of decay and consumption, a constant reminder of the fragility of the food supply. Food preservation wasn't just a chore, it was an ongoing war, fought daily with grit and ingenuity, ensuring that the Roman peasant could make it through another lean season. To understand the Roman peasant's diet, one must first grasp the grinding reality of food production. This wasn't a romanticized vision of pastoral bliss. It was backbreaking, sweat-drenched, relentless labor, a perpetual struggle against nature and the demands of an empire. There was no escaping the earth, the sun, and the sheer physical toll of bringing forth sustenance. Farming was intensely labor-intensive. Imagine a landscape without tractors, without mechanical harvesters, without even a decent chemical fertilizer. Every task, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, was performed by hand, or with primitive tools and draft animals like oxen or donkeys. The human body was the primary machine, pushed to its limits from dawn till dusk. It was a life defined by physical exertion, by calloused hands, aching backs, and the constant, nagging fatigue that seeped into your bones. The rhythm of the seasons dictated everything, and the demands were unyielding. Many peasants worked small holdings, tiny plots of land, often barely enough to sustain a family. These were precarious existences, constantly teetering on the edge of disaster. A single bad harvest, a sudden illness, or an unforeseen expense could easily push a family into debt, forcing them to sell their land and become tenant farmers or landless laborers. There was no safety net, just the unforgiving land and the relentless pressure to produce. These small plots were farmed with meticulous care, every inch of soil coaxed to yield its maximum, every weed a personal affront. Tenant farming was a widespread system, and often a brutal one. Peasants worked land owned by wealthy landlords, giving a significant share of their harvest, sometimes a third, sometimes a half or more, as rent. This system was designed to keep the rich, rich, and the poor, well, farming. It meant that even after a successful harvest, a peasant family might find themselves with barely enough left to feed themselves, let alone generate a surplus. They were essentially sharecroppers, perpetually tied to the land, their labor enriching another while they themselves scraped by. It was a cycle of dependency, a form of economic serfdom that offered little hope of upward mobility. The tools of the trade were simple, ancient, and effective for their purpose, if brutally inefficient by modern standards. Simple plows, often just a sharpened piece of wood, were pulled by oxen. Scythes and sickles were used for harvesting grain, requiring immense skill and endurance. Hoes and picks were the everyday companions for weeding and breaking up stubborn soil. There were no complex machines, just the raw power of humans and animals, guided by millennia of agricultural knowledge. Every tool was an extension of the body, and every task was a direct physical challenge. And overarching all of this was the absolute dependence on the weather. This was the ultimate gamble, the unpredictable factor that could make or break a year, a family, or even a region. A drought could mean crop failure and widespread starvation. Too much rain could lead to mold and rot. Hailstorms could flatten fields in minutes. Pestilence, locusts, crop blights could wipe out entire harvests. Famine was always just one bad season away, a constant, terrifying threat that loomed over every planting and every growing season. Peasants prayed to the gods, hoped for benevolent weather, and worked themselves to exhaustion, knowing that their very survival hung by a thread, utterly dependent on the capriciousness of nature. The Roman agrarian life was a testament to human endurance, a daily struggle against forces both natural and economic, all for the sake of the most basic necessity, food. The Roman peasants' entire existence, and certainly their diet, was inexorably tied to the rhythm of the agricultural year. This wasn't a seamless, consistent supply of food. It was a cyclical journey through seasons of scarcity and, if they were lucky, seasons of relative plenty. Each phase brought its own specific labors, anxieties, and changes to the sparse larder. Spring planting was a period of renewed hope and hard work. After the lean, often brutal winter months, the thawing earth offered the promise of new life. Fields were plowed, seeds were sown, wheat, barley, legumes, with careful precision and desperate prayers for a good harvest. It was a time of intense effort, preparing the soil, mending tools, and beginning the long process of coaxing sustenance from the ground. Fresh green shoots emerging from the earth were not just plants, they were symbols of hope, the first tangible sign that the hunger of winter might soon abate. This was a period of optimistic toil, tempered by the ever-present knowledge of how much could still go wrong. Summer brought the relentless heat and the arduous task of tending the fields. Weeding was a never-ending chore, preventing invasive plants from stealing precious nutrients from the crops. Watering, if possible, was critical during dry spells. Peasants would spend long days under the scorching sun, constantly vigilant, constantly working, praying for just the right amount of rain, not too much to cause rot, not too little to cause drought. It was a time of anxious waiting, a period where the fate of the harvest, and thus the family's survival, hung in the balance, utterly dependent on the whims of the weather. Every wilting leaf, every patch of dry earth sparked a fresh wave of anxiety. Autumn harvest was the most critical period, the culmination of an entire year's labor. This was when the fruits of their toil were finally gathered in. Grains were reaped, olives picked, grapes harvested. It was an incredibly intense, exhausting time, demanding every able body, from dawn till dusk. But it was also a time of relief, and, if the harvest was good, of celebration. If the granaries and storage amphorae were filled, there might be a brief period of feasting, a rare opportunity to eat fresh, abundant food. However, if the harvest failed, despair would quickly set in, as the grim prospect of famine loomed large. The autumn harvest wasn't just about collecting food, it was about securing survival for the next year. And then came the long, lean winter months. This was the season of surviving on preserved foods, dried grains, salted fish, pickled vegetables, dried fruits. Fresh produce was incredibly scarce, and the diet became even more monotonous and calorie-focused. It was a time of counting every stored morsel, hoping supplies would last until the spring planting yielded new food. Hunger was a constant companion, exacerbated by the cold and the sheer lack of variety. Illness was rampant, immune systems weakened by poor nutrition. Winter was the crucible of Roman peasant life, a season of wishing you had more and of making what you had stretch to its absolute limit. This cycle of life and death was directly tied to the success of the harvest. Famine was always just one bad season away, an ever-present specter. The agricultural year wasn't just a calendar. It was the very pulse of peasant existence, dictating their energy levels, their moods, and their chances of survival. It was a relentless, unforgiving rhythm, demanding constant effort and offering only sporadic, hard-won rewards. The Roman peasant lived and died by the seasons, a stark reminder of humanity's deep primal connection to the earth and its fragile bounty. Once food was produced, with immense effort and a fair amount of prayer, it then had to be distributed. And for the Roman peasant, this wasn't a matter of strolling down brightly lit supermarket aisles. Oh no. This was a complex, often precarious system of local markets, desperate bartering, and, for some, the occasional, politically charged, fleeting grain dole. Local markets, or macellum, were bustling hubs of commerce and haggling, the heart of economic life in towns and cities. Here, peasants with a small surplus, a rarity for many, might sell their extra produce, a few chickens, a basket of olives, a bit of cheese. In turn, they would buy necessities they couldn't produce themselves, from tools to basic pottery. Imagine the cacophony of voices, the smells of fresh and not so fresh produce, the constant negotiation over prices, the jostling crowds. It was a vibrant, if sometimes intimidating, environment where supply and demand played out on a very immediate, very physical level. For the peasant, it was a crucial interface with the wider economy, a place to turn labor into tangible goods. Bartering was often preferred and even necessary over cash transactions, especially in rural areas where currency was scarce. Money simply didn't circulate widely among the poorest. So, trading a few chickens for a sack of olives, a bushel of grain for a repaired tool, or labor for food was a common practice. This was a deeply personal, relational economy built on trust, or at least repeated interactions, within communities. It was a system that functioned on direct exchange, bypassing the need for coins and reflecting the localized, self-sufficient nature of much of peasant life. It was inconvenient, but it worked. Then there was the annona, the state grain supply. This was primarily for the urban poor of Rome itself, and later extended to other major cities. It was a monumental logistical undertaking, designed to provide a monthly ration of cheap or free grain to eligible citizens. For the millions crammed into Rome's insulae, the annona was a critical lifeline, often the difference between hunger and starvation. Imagine the queues, stretching for blocks, of desperate citizens waiting for their allocation of grain. It was a bare-bones existence, certainly, but it kept them alive. The annona wasn't just altruism. It was fundamentally a political tool. The Roman elite understood that a hungry populace was a dangerous populace. Bread and circuses, panem et circensense, wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a deliberate strategy. By providing cheap grain and public entertainment, the state could keep the Roman populace subdued, prevent riots, and maintain stability in the capital. It was a cynical but effective mechanism of social control, ensuring that the masses were fed just enough to prevent outright rebellion, but not enough to feel truly comfortable or empowered. The logistics involved in transporting food across the vast Roman Empire were staggering. Grain from Egypt and North Africa, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, all had to be moved by ships, wagons, and pack animals over immense distances. This was a massive undertaking, involving vast storage facilities, horia, complex administrative structures, and legions of workers. But this supply chain, while impressive, was slow, vulnerable to piracy, storms, and bureaucratic inefficiency. A disruption in this delicate system could spell disaster for a city like Rome, highlighting the fragility of even an empire's ability to feed itself. Food distribution for the Roman peasant was a patchwork system, a constant negotiation with scarcity, and a stark reminder that even in a powerful empire, sustenance was a daily struggle. While we paint a broad picture of Roman peasant diet, it's crucial to acknowledge that misery came in different flavors, depending on whether you were toiling in the dusty countryside or crammed into the teeming urban sprawl. The urban and rural peasant diets shared a common foundation of blandness and scarcity, but their specific challenges and occasional advantages diverged significantly. The rural peasant had a distinct advantage: access to fresh produce. If they owned a small plot, or even if they were tenant farmers, they could grow some of their own food: vegetables, herbs, perhaps a few fruit trees. This meant they could supplement their diet with fresh greens, roots, and seasonal fruits, providing crucial vitamins and a fleeting taste of variety. Moreover, they had the opportunity for wild foraging, gathering free food from the surrounding land, a vital supplement to their meager farm yields. Their food was often fresher, more direct from the source, and less likely to be adulterated. The urban peasant, however, faced distinct disadvantages. They were almost entirely reliant on markets and the grain dole. Food in the city was often more expensive, as it had to be transported and passed through various middlemen. It was also generally less fresh, having traveled some distance, and more prone to adulteration. Dishonest vendors might mix cheaper grains into flour or water down liquids. They lacked the space to grow their own food, making them utterly dependent on the urban supply chain, which could be unreliable and predatory. Yet, urban life did offer some peculiar benefits, however minor. City dwellers had more consistent access to garum and other condiments, if they could afford them, due to its ubiquity. Public bakeries were a major convenience, saving the urban poor the immense effort and fuel cost of baking their own bread. There might also be a greater theoretical variety of foodstuffs available in a bustling city market, though for a peasant with empty pockets, this was often just a tantalizing, unattainable display. They could see exotic fruits, even if they could never eat them. The urban environment brought its own distinct set of challenges. The stink of the city, food waste, overflowing latrines, poor sanitation permeated everything. This lack of hygiene meant that urban diets and food quality were often severely impacted by disease. Contaminated food and water were rampant, leading to higher rates of illness and mortality among the urban poor. Life in the city was a constant negotiation with filth and contagion, which directly affected what and how they could eat. Survival strategies, therefore, were tailored to their environment. For the rural peasant, it was about maximizing the yield from the land, foraging efficiently, and battling the elements. For the urban peasant, it was a relentless hustle for work, scrounging for rations, and navigating the precarious politics of the grain dole. Rural life offered potential self-sufficiency, but at the mercy of nature. Urban life offered a denser, more varied economy, but at the cost of personal space, fresh food, and sanitation. Both were different flavors of misery, different aspects of a life lived on the economic edge, demonstrating that while the Roman Empire shone brightly at its peak, its foundation was built on the varied but consistently challenging diets of its common people. For the Roman peasant, every meal was a desperate scramble for calories, not a balanced nutritional plan. This relentless focus on mere survival meant that their dietary health was almost universally abysmal, leading to a constant losing battle with chronic malnutrition and a host of debilitating illnesses. Their short, brutal lives were a testament to the profound impact of an inadequate diet. Common deficiencies were rampant. The grain-heavy, meat-scarce diet meant a severe lack of protein, crucial for growth and repair. Vitamins, especially vitamin C, found in fresh fruits and vegetables, vitamin A for vision, and vitamin D for bone health, were often in critically low supply. Iron deficiency, leading to anemia, was widespread due to a lack of red meat and other iron-rich foods. And other micronutrients, calcium, zinc, iodine, were likely present in quantities that would make a modern nutritionist gasp in horror. Imagine a diet that actively stripped your body of its essential building blocks. The impact on their health was devastating and visible. Stunted growth was common, bodies simply not reaching their full potential due to chronic nutrient deprivation. Weakened immune systems made them highly susceptible to every passing infection and disease, turning a minor cold into a life-threatening ordeal. Dental problems were ubiquitous. Worn teeth from gritty bread, cavities from lack of hygiene, and tooth loss from scurvy. Eye issues, skin lesions, brittle bones, all were direct consequences of a diet lacking vital components. Their bodies were constantly struggling, barely maintaining function. Common ailments read like a macabre checklist of deficiency diseases. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, led to bleeding gums, loose teeth, fatigue, and eventually death. Anemia, from iron deficiency, manifested as chronic tiredness and weakness. Rickets, from lack of vitamin D, resulted in bone deformities, particularly in children. Digestive issues were rampant, not just from malnutrition, but also from contaminated food and water, leading to chronic dysentery and diarrhea. Parasites, from poor hygiene and contaminated food, would have been a constant, insidious drain on their already limited nutrients. Their bodies were under siege from within and without. During periods of extreme scarcity, famine foods became the desperate, last-ditch effort for survival. Eating bark from trees, foraging for roots that offered little nutrition but filled the stomach, even consuming clay, these were the grim choices of a starving population. These desperate measures often led to further illness, as these foods were indigestible, toxic, or simply lacked any real nutritional value, accelerating the decline into death. Ultimately, this chronic, pervasive malnutrition contributed directly to the short, brutal life expectancy of the Roman peasant. A body constantly undernourished, constantly battling illness, simply couldn't endure for long. Child mortality was horrifyingly high, and those who survived childhood often succumbed to disease or the accumulated toll of their harsh existence by their 30s or 40s. Their diet, or rather the lack thereof, was not just a matter of taste. It was a matter of life and death, shaping every aspect of their physical being and contributing to a life of constant suffering. So, the next time you consider skipping a meal, remember the Roman peasant, for whom skipping a meal was often a prelude to a slow, agonizing decline. You might think that the Roman state, with all its grand pronouncements and intricate legal systems, would have been intimately involved in the daily sustenance of its poorest citizens. And you'd be partially right, but only partially. When it came to food, Roman law was a curious blend of necessity, political expediency, and a healthy dose of official indifference, especially when it came to the peasants who weren't rioting in the capital. The most famous, and perhaps most impactful, intervention was the annona system, the state-controlled grain supply, primarily for Rome and later other major cities. This was a massive, bureaucratic beast designed to procure, transport, and distribute vast quantities of grain to the urban poor. Its successes were monumental, preventing countless famines and keeping the peace in the volatile capital. But its failures were equally monumental, riddled with corruption, inefficiency, and favoritism. Grain ships could be lost to storms, officials could divert supplies, and the system could buckle under the strain of a bad harvest. It was a lifeline, but a deeply flawed one, constantly teetering on the brink of crisis. And remember, this was largely for the urban poor of Rome, not your average rural peasant struggling on their small plot. Sumptuary laws were another aspect of Roman legislation that, on the surface, touched upon food. These laws were primarily aimed at curbing elite extravagance, attempting to regulate luxurious consumption, particularly at banquets, to maintain traditional Roman values or to prevent excessive displays of wealth. They might dictate how much could be spent on a meal or what exotic foods were allowed. But let's be honest, these laws rarely, if ever, impacted peasants. The idea of a peasant being extravagant was a laughable absurdity. They couldn't afford a single peacock, let alone a banquet featuring a dozen. These laws were a distant, irrelevant rumble from the world of the ultra-rich, having no bearing on the daily struggle for mere calories. Land laws were far more pertinent, directly affecting food production, and thus the peasants' ability to eat. These laws, often complex and hotly contested, dealt with land ownership, inheritance, and usage. Too often, they favored the wealthy elite, allowing them to consolidate vast tracts of land, latifundia, and displace small landholders. This concentration of land in the hands of a few often led to more efficient, large-scale agriculture, but also to the impoverishment and displacement of countless peasants, turning them into tenant farmers or landless laborers. These laws directly dictated who could grow food, where, and what share they kept, fundamentally shaping the agrarian landscape and the dietary fortunes of the poor. Food safety regulations, as we understand them today, were minimal to non-existent. There was no FDA in ancient Rome. This led to widespread issues with adulteration, adding cheaper substances to more expensive foods, like sand to grain or water to wine. Contamination was rampant due to poor sanitation and storage practices, and outright fraud was common, with unscrupulous vendors selling spoiled goods or misrepresenting their products. Consumers, especially the poor, had little recourse and were largely at the mercy of the market. Getting sick from tainted food was a daily risk, a hidden tax on their already precarious existence. Ultimately, the empire's belly was a political as much as a dietary concern. How the government literally fed its populace, or let them starve, had immense political implications. Famine could lead to riots, instability, and a questioning of imperial authority. The state, therefore, acted as a massive, often inefficient, food broker, an operation essential not just for sustenance, but for maintaining social order and imperial control. Roman law concerning food was a reflection of power, economics, and the ever-present threat of a hungry, angry populace. For the peasant, it was less about protection and more about the often unseen legal frameworks that determined whether they would have grain to eat or a plot of land to grow it on. In the deeply superstitious world of ancient Rome, food wasn't just sustenance, it was intricately woven into the fabric of religion, belief, and the hope for divine favor. From solemn offerings to boisterous festivals, food played a crucial role in appeasing the gods, marking significant events, and reinforcing community bonds, even for the humble peasant whose daily fare was otherwise so grim. Offerings to the gods were a fundamental part of Roman religious practice. Peasants, like everyone else, would offer portions of their food, often the first fruits of the harvest, a small amount of wine, a bit of bread, to household deities, lares and penates, and to the greater pantheon. These offerings were made for good fortune, abundant harvests, protection from famine, or simply as an act of piety. Imagine a peasant carefully placing a few grains of spelt or a small unripe fig on a household altar, murmuring a prayer. It was a tangible act of faith, a desperate hope that divine intervention might bless their meager crops and protect their family from starvation. Religious festivals were often the only times the poor might gain temporary access to better food. Public festivals honoring various gods frequently involved large-scale animal sacrifices. After the gods had received their portion, usually the entrails and specific cuts, the remaining meat would be distributed to the attending populace. This was a rare, joyous occasion for peasants, a sudden, unexpected influx of precious meat protein. Imagine the excitement, the jostling, the sheer relief of having a piece of actual animal flesh to take home. It wasn't about the sanctity of the meat. It was about the calories, the fat, the protein, and the brief, glorious escape from a purely vegetarian diet. Praise the gods indeed for their sacrificial bounty. Food taboos, while less pronounced for Romans than for some other ancient cultures, like the Jews or Egyptians, were still present. Certain foods might be associated with specific deities or forbidden during particular rituals. For instance, specific types of wine or bread might be required for certain ceremonies. However, for the average peasant, whose options were already so limited, these taboos likely had little practical impact on their daily diet, as they were rarely in a position to choose from such a wide variety of foodstuffs anyway. Their taboos were more likely taboo due to cost or taboo due to scarcity. The sacred meal, particularly communal eating, was a powerful religious and social act, binding communities together. Even if the food itself was bland and simple, sharing it, especially at festivals or during harvest celebrations, reinforced social ties and a sense of belonging. It was a moment of shared humanity, a recognition of mutual dependency, and a collective expression of gratitude, or hope, for the harvest. The breaking of bread, the sharing of wine, these were ancient gestures of community and solidarity, imbued with spiritual significance. And finally, the hope of a better afterlife. Roman funerary art and epitaphs often depict idealized scenes of the deceased enjoying endless feasts, reclining on couches, surrounded by abundant food and flowing wine. This was a stark, poignant contrast to the earthly reality of the peasant's diet. The promise of an afterlife filled with rich, varied, and never-ending banquets was a powerful solace, a dream of gastronomic excess that stood in stark opposition to a life of perpetual hunger and monotony. For the Roman peasant, food was not just nourishment, it was a prayer, a ritual, a fleeting pleasure, and a profound hope for a better existence, both now and in the hereafter. In ancient Rome, the phrase, "what you eat is who you are," was never more profoundly true. Your diet wasn't just a matter of personal preference. It was a blazing, undeniable indicator of your wealth, your social standing, and your place in the rigidly stratified hierarchy of the empire. Every morsel on your plate, or lack thereof, was a marker, a silent declaration of your tax bracket before you even opened your mouth. Luxury foods were the exclusive domain of the elite, the ultimate symbols of wealth and power. Peacocks, flamingos, dormice stuffed with exotic spices, shellfish from distant lands, garum made from the choicest fish, and wines aged for decades. These were the culinary trophies of the absurdly wealthy. They imported ingredients from across the known world. Their banquets, a dizzying display of excess, designed to impress, intimidate, and demonstrate their almost limitless resources. These foods were literally unimaginable for a peasant, as far removed from their reality as space travel is from ours. The lack of variety, therefore, was a clear and damning sign of poverty. If your diet consisted almost exclusively of the unholy trinity, grain, olive oil, and diluted wine, with occasional legumes and foraged greens, then you were unequivocally poor. Your meal declared your social status more loudly than any toga or signet ring. The limited options, the same flavors day in and day out, were not a choice. They were the consequence of economic necessity, a culinary straitjacket imposed by circumstance. The poor ate to survive. The rich ate to display their wealth. Public perception further reinforced this divide. Even the smell of a peasant's meal differed distinctly from the perfumed feasts of the rich. Imagine the pervasive aromas of garlic, onions, stale bread, boiled cabbage, and fermented fish clinging to the clothes and breath of the common folk. This stood in stark contrast to the elite, whose meals might feature exotic spices, roasted meats, and delicate wines, often consumed in perfumed dining rooms. The olfactory landscape of ancient Rome was itself a social indicator, dividing the fragrant halls of power from the pungent, earthy realities of the working class. Aspiration, for the Roman peasant, often centered around the dream of a good meal. A meal with meat, a fresh piece of fruit out of season, a genuinely good, undiluted wine. These were almost as elusive as upward mobility itself. The dream wasn't of empire or glory. It was often simply of satiety, of a meal that wasn't bland, gritty, or perpetually insufficient. Food was a tangible representation of a better life, a life free from the constant gnawing of hunger. So, while the Roman Empire was built on the backs of its common people, its glory was never reflected in their plates. Their diet was a stark, unchanging testament to their low social standing, a constant reminder of their place in the rigid hierarchy. Every meal was a declaration, every morsel a marker, showcasing the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the lavish tables of the elite and the humble, often hungry, hearths of the Roman peasant. Having established the sheer unglamorousness of the Roman peasant's food, let's now turn to the equally unglamorous act of eating it. Forget everything you've seen in movies about Romans reclining languidly on couches, being fed grapes by slaves. That, my friends, was strictly for the elite. For the peasant, dining etiquette, or the distinct lack thereof, was purely functional, a swift, no-nonsense affair designed for maximum caloric intake and minimal fuss. There was certainly no reclining for the Roman peasant. The triclinium, those elegant dree-couch dining arrangements, were for the wealthy. Peasants sat, or more likely, squatted on the floor, or perched precariously on a simple stool. Imagine a rough, unadorned wooden table, or perhaps just a shared cloth on the dirt floor of a hut. Comfort was a luxury, and efficiency was the priority. You ate to refuel, not to relax or display your social graces. Hands and fingers were the primary utensils. This wasn't a matter of barbaric crudeness, it was simply the practical reality. No silver spoons or delicate knives here, just calloused, often unwashed fingers. Food was pulled apart, scooped up, and conveyed to the mouth with the most efficient tools available, your own digits. This was a direct, tactile relationship with your food, unmediated by any fancy implements. Hygienic? Probably not. Effective? Absolutely. Communal bowls were the norm. Sharing was a necessity, not just a nicety or a communal bonding ritual, though it served that purpose too. A single large pot of pulse, or thin stew, would be placed in the center, and everyone dipped in. There was no concept of individual plates, no sense of personal portion control. You ate what you could, when you could, from the shared bounty. This fostered a sense of community, certainly, but also a quiet competition, ensuring you got your share before it was all gone. Speed eating was also a consequence of their lifestyle. Meals were functional, designed to fuel up quickly before returning to labor. There was no leisurely conversation, no prolonged enjoyment of courses. The focus was entirely on sustenance. Imagine shoveling down your pulse with grim determination, your eyes on the next spoonful, your mind already on the next task. Meals were not leisurely social events. They were vital pit stops in a day of continuous, demanding work. The atmosphere at the peasant's table was, therefore, functional, often quiet, and focused squarely on sustenance rather than conversation or entertainment. The clinking of cutlery was replaced by the rustle of rough cloth, the slurping of porridge, and the occasional grunts of satisfaction. It was the silence of eating when you're truly hungry, a serious business where every calorie counted. The peasants' dining experience was a stark reflection of their life, pragmatic, communal, and utterly devoid of anything resembling luxury or leisure. So next time you complain about someone chewing too loudly, remember the Roman peasant, whose table manners were dictated by hunger, not refinement. Just as the Roman peasants' dining etiquette was dictated by functionality, so too were their eating implements. Forget the elaborate array of cutlery we take for granted today. For the common Roman, tools for eating were boiled down to the absolute bare necessities, a testament to efficiency, poverty, and the enduring power of the human hand. The universal utensil, as we've already touched upon, was your own grubby fingers. They were efficient, always available, and cost absolutely nothing. Bread was torn, vegetables were grasped, and porridge was scooped. This was the most direct, practical, and unpretentious way to eat. Hygienic? Perhaps not by modern standards, but in a world without soap and running water, hygiene was a rather fluid concept. It was a hands-on, deeply personal interaction with one's food, a primal connection to the source of sustenance. Imagine the tactile experience of every meal, the feeling of the coarse bread, the slimy pulse, the rough skin of an olive. Spoons, or lingulae, were simple but essential tools for liquid or semi-liquid foods like pulse and thin soups. These were typically made from wood, bone, or sometimes bronze if a family was slightly better off. They were rudimentary, often unadorned, scoop-shaped implements, designed purely for practicality. Owning a spoon was a small convenience, a practical luxury that allowed for a slightly cleaner and more efficient consumption of gruel. It was not a table setting. It was often a personal possession, carried by the individual, used daily, and treasured for its utility. Knives, or coulter, were also part of the peasant's toolkit, though perhaps not strictly a dining utensil in the modern sense. They were primarily used for cutting meat, if you were lucky enough to have any, slicing bread, or preparing vegetables. These were often simple iron knives, robust and utilitarian, frequently serving multiple purposes around the hut or in the fields. A knife was often a personal tool, carried on the belt or kept close at hand, rather than being part of a formal table setting. You'd use it to prepare your food, and then perhaps use your fingers to eat it. It was a tool of utility, not a delicate piece of silverware. Bowls and plates were equally humble. Simple pottery, often locally made and unadorned, formed the basic dinnerware. Wooden bowls were also common, durable, and cheap. For the truly destitute, a piece of stale bread might even serve as an improvised plate, soaking up liquids and then being eaten itself, a truly zero-waste approach. Your dinnerware matched your dignity, humble, functional, and easily replaceable, if you could afford to replace it. There were no fine china sets, no elaborate serving platters, just basic vessels to hold the precious calories. And the glorious absence of forks. Forks, as we know them, were not invented until much later in history. This spared the Roman peasant the indignity of trying to eat a thick, gummy porridge with a two-tined implement, a feat that would surely have ended in frustration and more food on the floor than in the mouth. The peasants' eating tools were a reflection of their practical, no-nonsense approach to life, simple, effective, and utterly unpretentious. They had what they needed, and nothing more, proving that sometimes the simplest tools are truly the most functional. While we've painted a general picture of the Roman peasant diet, it's crucial to understand that the vastness of the Roman Empire meant that this basic palate was subject to significant regional variations. The core elements, grain, olive oil, wine, remained, but local agricultural practices, climate, and indigenous food cultures subtly altered the specific flavors of misery from one province to another. The empire's diet was surprisingly diverse, even in its unwavering commitment to blandness. In Italy proper, the heartland of the empire, the standard Roman diet was most pronounced. Here, grain, wheat, spelt, barley, olive oil, and wine formed the bedrock. Legumes like lentils and broad beans were staples, supplemented by local vegetables and seasonal fruits. This was the benchmark of blandness, the dietary template from which all other variations diverged. It was a diet profoundly shaped by the Mediterranean triad, reflecting centuries of local agricultural tradition. Venture north into Gaul, modern-day France, and Britannia, and you'd find a noticeable shift. Here, the climate was cooler, wetter, and less hospitable to extensive olive groves and vineyards. Consequently, the diet often included more meat, especially pork and various types of game, more dairy products, milk and cheese, often from cows rather than just sheep and goats, and a much greater emphasis on beer as the common drink rather than wine. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots, though not the orange variety we know today, were more prominent. These were the barbarian comforts, often looked down upon by the sophisticated Romans, but pragmatic and nourishing for the locals. Imagine trading your thin, sour wine for a hearty, frothy brew, a different kind of daily escape. Egypt, a crucial grain basket for Rome, offered a diet that was, in many ways, a continuation of ancient Egyptian culinary traditions. Wheat and barley were paramount, but so were lentils and fava beans, which had been staples there for millennia. Onions and garlic were widely consumed, and beer remained a popular drink alongside wine. The Nile's fertile banks supported a rich agricultural bounty, but the basic dietary elements remained consistent with a grain and legume focus. It was an ancient diet, Romanized only in its political control, not its fundamental composition. Greece, the older cousin of Rome, had a diet very similar to Italy's, reflecting its shared Mediterranean climate and agricultural traditions. However, there was often a greater emphasis on fish, given its extensive coastline, more varieties of olives and olive oil, and a slightly different array of local herbs. The Greek palate, arguably, was a bit more refined, but the underlying components of the peasant diet remained largely the same: simple, seasonal, and calorie efficient. This brings us to the Romanization of diet. As the empire expanded, it certainly spread certain food crops and tastes. Roman legions and colonists brought their preferred grains, their olive trees, and their grapevines. Public granaries and trade routes introduced Roman staples to new regions. But local traditions were incredibly resilient, adapting Roman influences to local availability. So, while a newly conquered province might start cultivating wheat or making garum, their indigenous foods, cooking methods, and dietary preferences often persisted, creating a fascinating blend of imperial influence and local custom. The Roman peasant diet, therefore, was a rich tapestry of localized misery, united by its basic components, but flavored by the diverse landscapes of an immense empire. The very act of Roman imperial expansion, while fueled by the monotonous diet of its foot soldiers and farmers, also had a reciprocal impact on the food landscape of the empire itself. New foods were introduced, trade routes flourished, and new problems inevitably arose, forever altering the gastronomic, or anti-gastronomic, in the peasant's case, map of the Roman world. One direct consequence was the introduction of new crops. As Rome conquered new lands, it encountered different flora and fauna. While many of these were exotic luxuries for the elite, some trickled down to affect the peasant diet. New varieties of fruits, some different pulses, and perhaps new strains of grains were introduced and gradually adopted where they suited the local climate. This wasn't a sudden dietary revolution, but a slow, organic process of agricultural diffusion, often led by veterans settling in new lands or by merchants seeking new markets. It offered a tiny, almost imperceptible increase in potential variety. Crucially, the empire facilitated the creation and maintenance of vast trade routes. Roads, ports, and sea lanes were built and protected, allowing for the movement of goods on an unprecedented scale. While the poor rarely saw the truly exotic stuff, cinnamon from distant lands, for instance, these routes did make basic foodstuffs more widely available. Grain could move from Egypt to Rome, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul. This intricate network, while primarily serving the cities and the elite, had trickle-down effects, potentially stabilizing prices or offering slightly more consistent supply for the common folk, even if their diet remained inherently simple. Grain imports were perhaps the most significant impact on the everyday diet, especially for the urban poor. Rome itself could not feed its massive population from Italian soil alone. The empire's breadbasket shifted to provinces like Egypt and North Africa, whose fertile lands were systematically exploited to feed the capital. This changed agricultural landscapes in these provinces, often forcing them to specialize in grain production for export, sometimes at the expense of their own local food security. The Roman peasant in Italy might not have seen these foreign grains on their plate, but their tax money and the imperial machine they served certainly relied on them. However, imperial expansion also brought new environmental problems. The relentless demand for food, particularly for the ever-growing cities and legions, led to extensive agricultural expansion. Forests were cleared for farmland, often leading to deforestation and soil erosion. Overgrazing by livestock, driven by the demand for meat, even if rare for peasants, and leather, contributed to desertification in some areas. These were long-term environmental consequences that often came back to haunt the very peasants trying to eke out a living from the land, making their already precarious existence even more challenging. The irony of it all is rather darkly comedic. The empire's immense wealth, its grandeur, its impressive infrastructure, was all built on the backs of people fueled by a monotonous, often inadequate diet. The peasant, in their grinding labor and their simple meals, was the unsung hero, the indispensable cog in the machine that allowed this vast imperial project to flourish. Their resilience, their ability to sustain themselves on so little, was the true foundation of Roman power, a testament to sheer grit and grim determination, enabling the very expansion that would, in turn, subtly reshape their already meager plates. The Roman state, that massive, bureaucratic, and often ruthless entity, wasn't just concerned with legions and laws. It was intimately involved in the complex and often precarious business of feeding its machine, its cities, its army, and, crucially, its populace. This wasn't a benevolent act. It was a matter of strategic necessity, an intricate dance of infrastructure, procurement, and political control designed to maintain stability, even if it only delivered gastronomic mediocrity to the masses. Infrastructure was key. The Romans, those masters of engineering, built an incredible network of roads, ports, and granaries specifically to ensure the food supply to the cities. Imagine vast harbors teeming with grain ships, monumental warehouses, horea, capable of storing millions of bushels, and a meticulously maintained road system designed for rapid transport. This wasn't just about moving goods, it was about moving survival. It was a vast, complex system, often awe-inspiring in its scale, all geared towards delivering the absolute basics. Grain procurement was perhaps the state's most colossal logistical challenge. It involved a mix of methods: taxes paid in kind, meaning farmers had to hand over a portion of their harvest, outright purchases, and, when necessary, forced requisitions from conquered territories. Provinces like Egypt and North Africa became the empire's breadbaskets, their agricultural output diverted to feed the insatiable maw of Rome. This was the ultimate logistical challenge, demanding meticulous planning, massive manpower, and a ruthless efficiency to ensure the steady flow of grain that kept the capital from starving. Price controls were another tool in the state's arsenal. Attempts, often futile, were made to keep food affordable, especially grain, to prevent riots and maintain social stability. The Roman authorities understood that unchecked food prices could quickly lead to widespread unrest. These controls were a delicate balancing act, trying to ensure fair prices for producers while keeping food accessible for the poor, a challenge that any modern government would recognize. They were often difficult to enforce, susceptible to corruption, and prone to market manipulation, but the intent was clear: keep the populace fed and quiet. Famine relief efforts were sporadic and often too little, too late, and primarily focused on Rome itself. When widespread crop failures occurred in the provinces, the state's response was often slow, inadequate, or entirely absent, leading to immense suffering and mass migration.
The priority was always the capital, the seat of power, the place where unrest could quickly spiral out of control. Peasants in distant rural areas were often left to fend for themselves, relying on their own resilience and the goodwill of their communities. Ultimately, the Roman state functioned as a massive, often inefficient, food broker. It was an operation of immense scale and complexity, absolutely essential for imperial control.
By managing the food supply, by ensuring at least a baseline of sustenance, the state could maintain its grip on power, suppress dissent, and keep its vast administrative and military machinery functioning. The Roman state didn't just rule an empire, it literally fed it, for better or for worse, acknowledging that even the most powerful empire in history was fundamentally reliant on the basic biological needs of its people. The machine needed to be fed, and the state was the one to do it, even if the fuel was bland and monotonous. For the Roman peasant, famine and scarcity were not abstract concepts from history books. They were the ever-present specter, the terrifying shadow that lurked just beyond the horizon of every harvest. Life was a constant, precarious dance on the edge of starvation, where one bad season, one stroke of ill fortune, could plunge an entire family or community into unspeakable suffering. The causes of famine were multifactorial, a cruel cocktail of natural disasters and human incompetence. Droughts, prolonged periods without rain, were perhaps the most common culprit, scorching crops and turning fertile fields to dust. Floods, on the other hand, could wipe out entire harvests in a single, devastating deluge. Pestilence, locust swarms devouring crops, or fungal blights ruining grain, could destroy years of labor in weeks. War, with its disruption of agriculture, scorched earth tactics, and seizure of resources, was a man-made catalyst for starvation. And of course, incompetent governance and corruption could exacerbate natural disasters, turning localized scarcity into widespread famine by failing to distribute relief or by hoarding supplies. The impact of famine was catastrophic. It led to widespread starvation, bodies wasting away, children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes. Disease, always a threat, became rampant as weakened immune systems succumbed to every infection. Cholera, dysentery, typhus, these scourges swept through malnourished populations, killing far more than hunger alone. Social unrest would inevitably erupt. Riots in cities, banditry in the countryside, desperate people doing desperate things to survive. Mass migration from rural areas to cities or from one region to another became common, as people desperately sought any scrap of food, only to often find more hunger and disease. It was the ultimate, brutal diet plan: no food. Peasant resilience, however, was also a remarkable aspect of this grim reality. Faced with starvation, they developed desperate strategies for survival. Extreme foraging became necessary, eating anything that could be found: wild roots, bitter berries, even tree bark if it came to that. Hoarding any surplus, however small, was a primal instinct, a desperate attempt to create a buffer against the inevitable lean times. Eating famine foods, things normally avoided due to toxicity or lack of palatability, was a grim necessity. Desperate begging, selling children into slavery, or resorting to outright theft were the last resorts, the tragic choices born of unimaginable hunger. The desperate measures taken during extreme scarcity paint a horrifying picture. People would eat things normally avoided, substances that offered little to no nutrition but simply filled the stomach. Tree bark stripped from trunks, fibrous roots dug from the ground, even clay or dirt ingested in a desperate attempt to alleviate hunger pangs. These often led to further illness, stomach blockages, and accelerated decline. It was the grim, final chapter of famine, a testament to the absolute depths of human suffering. The state's response, as noted, was often inadequate. While Rome might rush grain to its capital, distant provinces or marginalized rural communities were often left to their fate. Relief efforts, when they came, were often too little, too late, and frequently undermined by corruption. This failure to adequately respond to famine led to immense suffering and, perhaps most dangerously, a profound questioning of imperial authority. For the Roman peasant, famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a constant, looming threat, a brutal reminder of the fragility of life and the often indifferent hand of both nature and empire. Unlike the romanticized tales spun by ancient historians, archaeology offers a far more grounded, if often grim, insight into the Roman peasant's diet. It's the dirt under the fingernails, sifting through the rubbish approach to history, literally digging up the past's plate to see what morsels of truth remain. And sometimes, those morsels are remarkably illuminating. Carbonized seeds and grains are a literal treasure trove. When a cooking pot containing grain was accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, burnt in an ancient fire, the organic material can carbonize, preserving its structure for millennia. Archaeologists unearth these tiny, blackened remnants, wheat, barley, spelt, lentils, directly showing us what was grown, processed, and eaten. Finding these in peasant dwellings, in burnt storage pits, or even in cooking hearths provides direct evidence of the staple foods, often revealing a surprisingly limited and consistent range of crops. It's like finding an ancient burnt grocery list, offering undeniable proof of their daily fare. Animal bones provide crucial evidence of meat consumption, or, more often, the glaring lack thereof. Excavating a peasant's home or a community refuse pit and finding very few bones, or predominantly bones from small, less desirable animals, like young pigs, sheep, or poultry, often butchered in ways that suggest maximum meat extraction, tells a clear story. Identifying the species and examining butchery marks gives insights into what animals were available, how they were prepared, and who was eating them. The absence of large, prime cuts, so common in elite settings, speaks volumes about the peasant's protein-poor diet. Middens, or ancient trash pits, are arguably the most glamorous side of dietary archaeology. These are simply ancient rubbish dumps, but for an archaeologist, they are a treasure trove. Discarded food remains, broken pottery that held meals, food scraps, discarded bones, even remnants of plant material, tell tales of daily life. The types of seeds, bones, and even pollen found in middens provide a direct, unfiltered glimpse into the diet of ordinary people, far removed from the idealized descriptions of elite authors. They are the candid snapshots of ancient eating habits. And then we come to the truly glamorous side of archaeology, coprolites. Yes, fossilized feces. This, my friends, is where science truly gets down and dirty. Analyzing ancient human waste can reveal astounding levels of detail about diet, undigested plant matter, tiny bone fragments, parasite eggs, and astonishing levels of grit, confirming our earlier suspicions about peasant bread. While it might not be the most appealing discovery, Coprolites offer an incredibly direct and personal insight into what a Roman peasant truly ingested, confirming everything from their grain staples to their parasitic infestations. It's an unpleasant but undeniably potent historical record. Finally, while often biased, wall paintings and mosaics can sometimes offer glimpses of daily life, including food. While the grand, elaborate dining scenes typically depict elite consumption, some rustic scenes or depictions of market stalls might inadvertently show common vegetables, fruits, or basic bread. These visual sources, when interpreted carefully, can complement the hard archaeological data, adding a visual layer to our understanding. What we know from the dirt, bones, and ancient poop is that the Roman peasant diet was relentlessly basic. What we guess is that it was utterly devoid of joy. The archaeological evidence paints a grim, consistent picture of a life lived on the very edge of nutritional adequacy. While archaeology gives us the gritty, undeniable truth from the ground, literary sources present a more complex, often frustrating picture of the Roman peasant's diet. The major problem? Ancient authors, for the most part, were members of the elite. And like modern social media influencers, they mostly wrote about what they ate, what they saw, and what they considered important, which rarely involved the mundane, impoverished meals of the common folk. So, what did ancient authors write about? Mostly about elite feasts, not peasant meals. Think of it as ancient Instagram, but only for the disgustingly rich. Descriptions of lavish banquets, exotic ingredients, and intricate dishes abound in the works of satirists like Juvenal, historians like Livy, and gastronomes like Apicius. These texts offer a tantalizing glimpse into the culinary excesses of the wealthy, but they are a distorted mirror for the reality of the vast majority. They tell us what was possible to eat if you were fabulously rich, not what was actually eaten by the millions who powered the empire. It's like trying to understand the diet of a factory worker by reading a celebrity chef's cookbook. Poets and philosophers occasionally offered mentions of simple living, but these were often romanticized and, let's be honest, wildly inaccurate portrayals of peasant life. Horace might praise the virtues of a rustic meal of lentils and herbs, but he was doing so from the comfort of his well-appointed villa, probably after enjoying a perfectly roasted pheasant. These were not observations from personal experience. They were intellectual exercises, moralizing tales that often glossed over the harsh realities of constant hunger and backbreaking labor. They presented an idyllic vision that bore little resemblance to the smoke-filled, grimy reality of a peasant's hut. Agricultural treatises, surprisingly, offer more practical insights. Authors like Columella and Cato the Elder wrote extensive works on farming practices, crop cultivation, and estate management. While primarily aimed at landowners and overseers, these texts sometimes reveal common peasant practices, the types of crops grown, the rations given to slaves, and the basic foodstuffs available. They provided practical advice, not poetic musings, giving us a more grounded understanding of the raw materials that formed the peasant diet. Here, we find mentions of barley, spelt, beans, and the management of olive groves, the very backbone of their sustenance. Legal texts can also provide fascinating, if indirect, glimpses into food regulations, grain doles, and even crimes related to food theft or adulteration. Laws concerning the annona system detail the state's efforts to provision Rome. Legal disputes over land or harvests can reveal the economic realities of food production. While not directly describing what a peasant ate, these texts illuminate the administrative and legal frameworks that governed the availability and distribution of food for everyone, including the poor. Reading between the lines, then, becomes a crucial skill. Extracting information about the poor from sources focused on the rich is like trying to find a single pea in a banquet of peacocks. We look for incidental mentions, for satirical digs at gluttony that implicitly highlight what most didn't have, or for practical advice that reveals the common availability of certain staples. The silence of the elite texts about the peasant diet is itself telling. It underscores their irrelevance in the eyes of the educated, their lives too mundane, too unglamorous to warrant detailed description. So, while literary sources offer pieces of the puzzle, they must be approached with a healthy dose of skepticism, understanding that the ancient narrative was overwhelmingly, and often ignorantly, biased towards the privileged few. You might think that a diet so relentlessly monotonous and seemingly depressing would have faded into the dust of history, unlamented and unremembered. But you'd be wrong. The Roman peasant's diet, for all its drabness, forms the enduring legacy, the fundamental bedrock upon which much of traditional European cuisine was built. Its influence stretches far beyond the fall of the empire, quietly shaping what millions would eat for centuries to come. The foundation of the Mediterranean diet, that celebrated modern eating pattern, is directly traceable to Roman influence, and, by extension, to the peasant staples. Grain, wheat, barley, olive oil, and wine remain central to the culinary traditions of Italy, Greece, Spain, and much of southern France. These weren't just Roman inventions. They were deeply rooted in the region, but Roman organization and expansion cemented their ubiquity. The ancient triad of sustenance, once the cornerstone of survival, became the revered, healthful model for modern eating, albeit with far more variety and enjoyment. Preservation techniques, born of necessity, were passed down through centuries, forming the backbone of traditional European cuisine. Salting meat and fish, drying fruits and grains, pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine, these methods ensured food security for millennia. The medieval peasant, the early modern farmer, all utilized variations of these Roman techniques. Your grandmother's pickles, your cured ham, your dried herbs, they all owe a debt to the Roman peasant's desperate battle against the rot. This wasn't culinary innovation. It was continuous, practical application of ancient wisdom. Basic vegetable and legume cultivation also has deep Roman roots. Many common European crops, cabbage, lentils, broad beans, onions, garlic, various herbs, were either widely cultivated by the Romans or spread by them throughout their empire. These plants became staples across the continent, continuously cultivated for millennia, forming the backbone of everyday meals long after the legions had packed up their Pascha. What was once a component of bland pulse became an ingredient in 1,000 different regional stews and soups, testament to its resilience and utility. Perhaps the most sobering legacy is the persistence of poverty, and with it, the simple, often monotonous diets that continued for millennia. The fundamental challenges of food security, seasonal availability, and limited resources meant that for vast swaths of the population across Europe, eating remained a functional, basic act until the agricultural and industrial revolutions brought about genuine widespread change. The medieval serf's diet was, in many ways, an echo of the Roman peasants. Grain-heavy, meat-scarce, and utterly dependent on the immediate environment. It's a humbling realization that the struggle for basic sustenance was a near universal human experience for an astonishingly long time. So our modern diets, for all their dizzying variety and convenience, owe a profound, if largely unacknowledged, debt to this fundamental, often bleak, ancient eating. The Roman peasant, with their gritty bread and their bowl of pulse, laid the gastronomic groundwork for an entire continent. Their ability to survive, to sustain an empire on so little, is a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and an incredibly robust digestive system. It's a stark reminder that beneath the grandeur of empires, there lies the enduring, unglamorous, and utterly vital story of what ordinary people ate and how that shaped the world. And so, my weary, nutritionally pampered friends, we reach the end of our epic 200-minute culinary journey into ancient despair. We've traversed the dusty fields, navigated the smoky huts, and peered into the perpetually insufficient bowls of the Roman peasant. What have we learned? That their diet was monotonous, yes. Drab, certainly. But also utterly vital, a testament to human endurance, adaptation, and an unshakable will to simply exist. We've seen that their lives revolved around the unholy trinity of grain, olive oil, and diluted wine, supplemented by seasonal vegetables, legumes for protein, and the occasional mythical morsel of meat. We've explored the arduous process of food production, the relentless battle against famine, and the ingenious, if unappetizing, methods of preservation. We've delved into the stark realities of their cooking methods, their functional dining etiquette, and the profound social implications of every meager meal. It was a diet designed not for pleasure or peak performance, but for sheer, unyielding survival. But let's not forget the human element. Behind the statistics, the descriptions of blandness, and the archaeological finds were millions of individuals. People with names, families, hopes, and fears, whose daily struggles for survival were profound and relentless. They woke up hungry, worked hungry, and often went to bed hungry, their bodies fueled by just enough to keep going. Their existence was a testament to the primal human drive to simply put food in front of their children, day after day, year after year. Their resilience is, in its own way, as awe-inspiring as any of Rome's architectural marvels. Now for my final sarcastic remarks. Hopefully, this culinary journey into ancient despair has prepared you for a long, uneventful sleep, perhaps dreaming of a truly varied diet filled with exotic spices and decadent desserts. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it will make you look at your next bowl of ramen with a newfound, profound appreciation. Remember, even that humble instant noodle is a culinary triumph compared to the average Roman peasant's fare. You are living in an age of gastronomic miracles, so celebrate it. The true strength of Rome, you see, was built not on lavish feasts of peacocks and dormice, but on the calloused hands and perpetually grumbling stomachs of these hardy, often hungry people. They sustained an empire on a diet of grain, grit, and grim determination. They were the silent majority, the uncelebrated engine, the living foundation that allowed Rome to rise, flourish, and endure for centuries. Their monotonous meals were, in their own unglamorous way, the very fuel of history. Thank you for enduring. If you've managed to stay awake through this entire exhaustive explanation of ancient culinary drabness, consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care. But your future self, longing for another deep dive into obscure historical misery, just might. Perhaps next time we'll cover Roman toilet habits. Now that's a topic that will truly make you appreciate modern plumbing. Go forth and eat something delicious. You've earned it. 1. Roman Peasants. The 200-minute guide to ancient blandness. 2. Grain, gruel, and grit. A Roman peasant's 200-minute menu. 3. The Empire's Fuel. 200 minutes on what Roman peasants really ate. Image. A single, dark, coarse loaf of ancient Roman bread, panis plebeius, on a rough wooden table next to a small, simple clay bowl filled with grayish gruel, pulse. A trickle of olive oil is visible on the bread. Text: 200-minute meal, Roman peasant edition. 2. Image. A split screen. On one side, a lavish Roman banquet, exaggeratedly opulent, almost cartoonish. On the other, a Roman peasant family huddled around a single steaming pot of bland gruel, looking weary. Your Roman fantasy versus reality, 200 minutes. A close-up of a Roman coin with a worried, slightly disgusted face superimposed on it. In the background, subtly blurred, are fields of grain and a smoky hut. 200 minutes of ancient fast food, and you won't like it. Ever wondered what truly fueled the Roman Empire? Hint, it wasn't lavish banquets. Join us for an epic 200-minute deep dive into the surprisingly bland, relentlessly monotonous, and utterly essential daily diet of the Roman peasant. Forget peacocks' tongues, we're talking grain, gruel, olive oil, and the constant battle against hunger. Prepare for immersive historical humor, darkly comedic narration, and enough dry wit to make you profoundly grateful for your modern pantry. Discover the gritty reality behind Rome's grandeur and why a Roman peasant would weep at the sight of your supermarket. This isn't just history. It's a culinary journey into ancient despair that will forever change how you view your next meal. Perfect for history buffs, comedy lovers, or anyone needing an epic, informative, and slightly traumatizing background listen.